All right, and we should be live. Welcome back, everyone, to the Vays YouTube channel. And here to discuss a very important topic that has literally taken me out of retirement of talking about Bitcoin development and Bitcoin news. This YouTube channel has basically become like geopolitics and other stuff. I think I'm going to shift it into health and wellness, but there was a really important topic that's has a lot of people very actively fighting. It's reminding some people of the 2017 fork wars. The taproot upgrade was not as controversial as the current upgrade coming up. And so I reached out to my old podcast partner, Jimmy Song, and I wanted to make this a little bit of a bigger group to discuss it, but instead we're going to do this in several parts. For part one, I also reached out to Adam Back, who, as you guys know, one of the people I really, really respect in the space. Have done multiple podcasts with Adam Back. Used to do a conference with Adam Back called Understanding Bitcoin. And so I thought it would be great to bring Adam back on here to discuss core version 30, what it is, what the controversy is, and get Adam's pro core take on it. Jimmy is gonna help me moderate this debate. I heard Jimmy in his podcast of shorts say that he is not interested in upgrading to version 30 unless Jimmy has changed his mind. So we will find out why that is. And then in part two, I'll probably bring on people from the completely opposite side, like Luke Dasjour and Mechanic, the guys from Ocean Pool, maybe one or two others that are very, very pro knots and get their take on the situation. And then maybe parts three and four, just some other people that have really good constructive opinions on the subject. All right, so with no further ado, I don't think our guests need any introduction. But Jimmy or Adam, I'm actually not sure
Oh,
who is better to neutrally describe
well,
the overall big picture of the debate before we go on with the details.
well, let me take a shot. I think we probably agree on like a bunch of the stuff. It's just like which weighting you give to risks ultimately. And but I would say you said like sides, but actually when I started into this a couple of weeks ago, I'm like, okay, there's some argument brewing. What's it about? People are making different arguments. Like this is good. That's good. This is a better approach. This will work, and so on. And so I tried to do the don't trust verify. I'm like, okay, you say that, but why? So apply but why to everything. So kind of went back to first principles and tried to, if somebody made some claim, try and work it out for myself. Is that true? You know, why would that be the case? Why would that be centralizing? What would the mind, what are the second and third order effects? And so, I was kind of doing it live on Twitter using people as sounding boards. So some people were a little confused because they thought I was on one side and then I thought I was on the other side, and they kind of felt like a swinging around. But I was just trying to figure it out, really. So, I think there were like missteps made, as in the block size debate. There are pros and cons, and there were tactical mistakes made, or bad faith assumptions made quickly, insults thrown around, all this kind of stuff, right? And there's also some kind of triggering aspect here, which is I think most people, I mean, there are actually three camps, but we're not really hearing much from the third camp, which is the spammers themselves and the miners enabling them. They're keeping generally relatively quiet. But interestingly enough, the sort of the developers who are working on the different not-for-profits that are contributing to the Bitcoin client and protocols, which includes Luke, obviously, um, all seem to agree that they don't like spam by and large. I mean, a few people said some kind of ambiguous or silly things, and it's a mixed bunch. But generally, the my impression is that the longer term contributors are largely kind of free market, libertarian, and don't like spam. It's annoying, and it's consistent for me because when I first got involved in Bitcoin, of course I heard about it in 2008, but like everybody else, didn't get into it for a while. And so my entry was during a previous time with a big spam debate, and the spam there was actually lazy app devs were the culprit, right? They would make some mobile app and they'd want to send a message or a hook or something, and they just stick it in a transaction as a fake pub key, and it would enrage the developers. So like, why can't you use a push notification? Why can't you use your own peer-to-peer network? And it just persisted and persisted. And BitMEX Research, Johnny Beer posted very interesting list of collection of screenshots and links to the Bitcoin Talk forum, which shows the genesis of the argument, which is kind of a rerun. It sounds, time's a flat circle. It sounds exactly like today, but it's in 2010, right? When I wasn't paying attention. I did go back and read a bunch of Bitcoin Talk, but not all of it. And it's all the same thing, lazy app devs putting junk in the chain. And ultimately, by 2014, it culminates to 4 years of frustration that there seems to be, you can shout at the spammers, you can give them examples of how to do it better, but there are certain physics of software. Developers are lazy, people are lazy to upgrade, defaults, kind of like the blinking setting on a set-top box. People don't set the time, and so it came to a head, and they made the op return, which is a very strange genesis for a feature, right? It's like we can't seem to persuade people to stop doing stupid stuff, so we'll make a less damage in place for them to put it. Now, I think there's a few actual uses for this data, which is reasonable and logical to do with financial use cases. I think, which is what when it diverges from financial use cases, or specifically Bitcoin specific financial use cases. A lot of meme junk on here now lately, and so there are examples like Lightning is using not op return, but it's putting some extra data in the chain for like a hash or something to coordinate the hash lock. And there are some other apps that are, so let's say, I guess timestamping is one, and some of the mixing protocols, like the Samurai one, puts a little bit of data. And so I think, like, to my perspective, that is a reasonable use. And I think the other argument is, well, why don't you just put it, why don't you put your data somewhere else, like put it on a website, put it on another peer-to-peer network, put it on Nostr, whatever. I think there's a legitimate answer, which is you need to be able to prove that it was published, right? Because Bitcoin is, you can reference it. It is a source of truth. There's no ambiguity. It either got published or it didn't. And so there is some kind of application value to that. But that's why the original op return was 40 bytes, because that was enough for a 32-byte hash, and like a little bit extra for like a database key or something. And so that was the genesis of it. But it turns out that there's actually no limit in the consensus rule, or it's like 1 MB, like basically the block size. And I think there was before that op return, there's like a bit of prehistory to op return, which I'm not super familiar with, but like there is an op return in like version 0.1. I think its behavior varied a bit. And a big part of this discussion actually is a distinction between policy and consensus rules, which is, we know what it is, but it's kind of a sophisticated concept. So apparently the original Bitcoin didn't have any policy. One of the book collection of links that BitMEX Research posted shows the discussion around the introduction of policy in the first place, right? Like where it was introduced. And so there's a bit of a debate as well about whether policy is sort of starting to there are cases, I guess, where policy becomes out of date and then it starts to be more of a negative than a positive of that use case. Now, it's complicated. So lots of things implemented with policy, some of which are pretty key and important, like fees. So, you can't say, I mean, I don't think you can realistically say let's deprecate policy, but it causes a lot of argument because it's very subtle. Policy can enforce things, it can enforce you not do things up to a certain limit. if you push it too hard, if a lot of users want something and the miners go along with it, they can bypass it. And that's happened a few times. Happened with full RBF. It happened with the low fees. Arguably, it was starting to happen with the larger op returns because the miners and the spammers and some Libre relay. Anyways, a lot of stuff there. So maybe I should pass it over to one of you guys to unpack some of that
Yeah,
technical
let me
detail.
let me jump in here.
Can I?
I wanna back up, Jimmy. So we have a lot of people that do watch the show and follow Bitcoin that don't understand at all
Okay,
what
yeah.
is
Let me
the big
start from the
argument.
beginning.
All right, let's back up a lot. Let's explain it to people like they are fifth graders. And I'm including myself in this, right? Like I was
Uh-huh.
very up to date in the last debate, but I'm in that boat as well. So let's
Yeah.
start explaining it like we know nothing. And the moment I don't understand something, I will interrupt you and ask a follow-up.
All right, all right. So this all began back with one of the core devs talking to a Citria developer. And if you don't know who Citria is, they're the makers of BitVM, and it's a different way to do smart contracts on Bitcoin, essentially by hiding most of it from the blockchain and not putting the entire smart contract and not making everyone verified and stuff like that. It's a really kind of cool project as far as the technical details go. But Robin Linus is the inventor of it. He's the CTO of Citria, and he was talking to one of the core devs, and and he was explaining that in this particular protocol called BitVM, which uses taproot and everything else, he said that in an emergency, it needs to put, I think, 144 bytes or something into a Bitcoin transaction. Now, you can put up to 80 bytes into an op return, like without any penalty. Everyone's going to relay it and so on. So, but he said, well, we need 144. So what we're going to do is have the 80 byte op return and then add two fake pub keys as taproot outputs, so that we get 64 additional bytes. That's 144, and that was his solution to putting 144 bytes on chain, so that they could do some sort of recovery or something like that.
And
This was
and this took place in the Taproot soft fork.
Yeah, well, no, it's not. It didn't take place. It's just something that they're using as a part of their BitVM protocol, right? Like
Okay,
they invented.
but was this around before Taproot? Were you able to do
No,
this?
no, no. It's BitVM is something that was invented post Taproot, and it's actually
Post,
something
right,
that
exactly. Okay, post Taproot. Okay, yeah. So
yeah, yeah.
I was
It's
right on
something that
that.
they
So
didn't.
it's yeah.
Yeah,
I mean, are you sure that Robin Linus is CTO at Citria? I didn't realize that. I thought he
yeah,
invented
yeah.
the
He's
BitVM thing.
CTO of Citria. Yeah, he's been talking about
Okay,
that for a
but
while,
I think they're
and he invented
also
BitVM
like
as well.
yeah, yeah. I mean, I think they're also a multiple BitVM based projects and some attempts to like incrementally
Oh,
improve
they all
the
combined.
cryptography.
They had like
Yeah.
7 different BitVM versions, and they all combined, and like they're all, and this is what they made is that company
Yeah.
Citria. All right. Anyway,
All
so
right,
he was
sorry, Jimmy.
Yeah.
talking.
Someone in the chat is saying Knots nodes don't relay 80 bytes of op return. Jimmy is wrong. Jimmy didn't say anything about Knots.
I'm just explaining what's going on right now, and yeah, this is kind of the heated rhetoric we're getting. Is
What
that
what
Guys,
was
people
said
want
is
to
try to
true,
accuse
but
each
listen.
other?
it's
So
not relevant.
yeah.
Try to listen more than commenting.
Yeah. All right. So they talk to each other, and obviously it's bad to have pub keys that don't have a private key because they can never be spent, right? This is UTXOs that would never be pruned from the chain. You have no idea if there is a private key that corresponds to it, and generally extra UTXOs that can't be spent being in your UTXO set is bad for everybody, because that's the confirmation process that every node runs. Is when you're validating a transaction, you have to make sure that all the inputs are not spent. So you keep that around, right, either very locally on disk or in RAM or something like that, and you make it very fast to validate transactions, and that's part of running a node. So very objectively speaking, having like having more UTXOs is worse than having more data on disk, because UTXOs are used more frequently and you need them to validate new transactions that come in. But if you have sort of junk in the UTXO set, it clogs things up significantly more than if you have junk on disk. So that's a trade-off that the core developers, I think, kind of reasonably thought, hey, we need to go and make sure that this doesn't happen, right? That people aren't using fake pub keys that have no private key, that they're not making unspendable UTXOs available. So what they did was they decided, okay, instead of having an 80 byte opt return, which is the limit has been for many years.
Can you just explain op return? We have some people in the audience that don't,
Okay.
I'm not sure
Yeah.
what op return is.
Okay, so op return is sort of like a field that evolved starting in like 2013 or something as a way to put in sort of extra data about a transaction. And this was a concession to like a lot of different protocols that were going on at the time. I think like Mastercoin and Counterparty and things like that, which wanted to use these op returns as a way to do like sort of like colored coins protocols essentially. But yeah, at first it was 40 bytes limit, and then it got doubled to 80, and it's been that way since like 2014 or something like that. And it's essentially like an arbitrary data field that you can fill with whatever you want. And as Adam suggested before, there are like legitimate use cases. I think BIP47, which is what Samurai wallet uses, is a way to exchange public keys, so you can do like a Diffie-Hellman key exchange and pay to an address that only the recipient and the sender knows about, and otherwise like you have no idea who it belongs to and so on. It's a privacy thing. And that's like a legitimate use of op return, for example. But it can also be used for lots of other things. Like people will put in all kinds of messages into op return, and you can see them if you go to any block explorer and look, and there's all kinds of messages in there. But that's what op return was. And so the core devs, after talking to Citria, the BitVM people, said, hey, like, okay, we don't want them to add to the UTXO set, especially stuff that can't be pruned and will sort of exist, and we have no idea if there's a private key for them, and it'll never sort of disappear from the UTXO set. They said, all right, let's increase. Well, at first they said, let's just get rid of this op return limit altogether. And so they, I believe it was Darcy or whoever that guy was. He's one of the core devs that works for Chaincode, I believe.
Oh, it's Antoine.
Antoine Darcier. Yeah.
Darcier. It's French center. Yeah.
So he made a pull request that eliminated this data carrier size. So in the Bitcoin Core software, there's a custom field that lets you say, okay, I will relay transactions that are this number of bytes or below for the data carrier size or the op return, right? So how much arbitrary data each transaction is allowed to have before I am willing to relay it to my peers. That's essentially what the option is. And the pull request just said, all right, we're going to eliminate this option and not make it available to users as part of this change, so that if people want to put in arbitrary data, they can, up to whatever 100,000 bytes, which is the other limit for the size of a transaction before you're willing to relay it. And that's part of the what a Bitcoin node does, is it checks for standardness, and one of the standards is that it has to be 100,000 bytes. So that was the original pull request, and then a lot of people got upset. Hey, why are you taking this option away? It's my node. I should get to do what I want with it, and so on. And that the pull request had a lot of controversy, but essentially was taken down and replaced by another pull request from Greg Sanders or InstaGibbs on X, and he basically kept the data carrier size option, but marked it as deprecated, changed it so that you can have multiple op returns, and he also made the default not 80 bytes but 100,000, which is no real limit at all because the size of a transaction for standardness is also 100,000 bytes.
So Jimmy, question: what for the timing of those things? Because there was a kind of a first version of this pull request which got nacked.
That was Antoine Darcier's. Yeah. So the second one is InstaGibbs.
Yeah,
I just talked about the first one and then the second one. And there was a lot of controversy around the first one in particular. Around the second one, because the GitHub comments went to like 400 or something like that. There were lots of people commenting saying neck or whatever. And actually, at a certain point, Bitcoin core devs put out a statement saying, "Hey, like this is why." And they ended up merging it and so on. And they said, this is why, because even though it's controversial and a lot of people are necking it, we feel that, this is the right thing to do. And, you don't have to download our client if you don't want, and so on. So and you can go look up that statement and who signed it and so on. It's on, I think, bitcoincore.org. Anyway, so that's kind of what happened, and there's been a lot of controversy since then. That was way back in like April or May, and since then the deprecation has been reversed. So Mike Schmidt put in a PR that essentially took away the deprecation part. And if you don't know what deprecated means, it means slated for deletion at some point in the future. And that was very controversial because people were like, okay, you're giving this back, but you're eventually going to delete it, right? Like, why are you doing that when it's a feature that I want for my node? And so after a lot of controversy, that went in maybe 3 weeks ago, I think, and it got backported into core version 30, which was released on Friday. So that's. I don't know if I tried to be very neutral in how I presented it, but that's essentially what happened with this particular op return controversy and why it got put in there in the first place, and how it sort of played out a little bit. Although there's a lot more to the story on those things.
So now the plan is, well, the core version 30's plan, just so I summarize it, is to leave the the op return isn't being eliminated because some people are confused. The op return just no longer has a limit on how much data can enter the op return, and you can now
by default you can still modify your core version 30 to say like you can set it as a setting in like bitcoind.conf that says data carrier size equals 80 or something like that, and have it pretty close to what previous versions had, although now it allows multiple op returns and there's no setting for that. But it's pretty close, right? And the idea being that users can still, determine, hey, I'm not going to relay any transactions with op return greater than 80 bytes, so I can set data carrier size to 80. But by default now it comes at 100,000, which is really no limit.
So for the layman person, right? So someone can make a Bitcoin transaction and fill the op return with so much data that if a miner mines the block with that transaction, it'll be the only transaction in the block.
Not quite, because 100,000 bytes is the limit, and so a block at least filled with those, it would need like 10 of those transactions.
Oh, 10 of those, right? It's a million. So and because of SegWit, you can have 4 of those, so times 4, because it's like
only if you're using SegWit. So op return doesn't get a SegWit discount.
Okay, so if you're using SegWit, and you maximize the op return data, you will have a maximum of 40 transactions in the block.
No, because op return does not get the SegWit discount. It has to be in the witness field. Op return is an output.
Got
so
it.
so the most you can do is like 10 of these, I guess.
10 of these.
At
Okay.
So I want
100,000.
to add a couple other points because I think there's some details there that may trigger people absent the rationale, let's say, or the extra context. So one context which is important to keep in mind is the op return at consensus level has apparently never had a limit, or like the limit is the block size. And for a period of time, it probably was notionally 32 megabytes because there was no block size, and that was some format limit in early Bitcoin, but probably would have crashed the node if anybody had done it. And then at some point, Satoshi introduced a block size limit, and that was a megabyte. And but there was no policy either for a while, right? And at some point later, I'm not sure exactly the sequence, whether this came before or after the 2014 op return, there was also a policy put in, which is not, consensus enforceable. It's just kind of good behavior hint for anti-DOS and sensible limits in the peer-to-peer network, I guess, ultimately, that transactions shouldn't be over 100 kilobytes. And so that is what the kind of unlimited op return runs into. Now, a miner can override that because it's consensus, right? Or somebody can use a transaction API from one of the miners, and there are people that have done that and made
Slipstream,
1 megabyte
yeah.
images or even 4 megabyte images approximately using the taproot. So I guess that's one factor. Now the other interesting thing
can I
thought,
just
yeah.
correct something? So Adam put out a thing about Robin Linus. I thought he was CTO of Citria. I guess he's not. So just want to
Did
correct
somebody
that.
correct it?
Correction.
Well,
I
Robin
wasn't
Linus
sure.
literally replied to your thing saying that I never
Oh,
worked for
good.
them. So,
Well, I thought that was the
I
case.
think
That's
he's a
why I
pretty good
asked, but
source.
yeah.
Like,
That'll answer it. Yeah.
But yeah, I believe it was Antoine Darcier definitely talked to somebody from Citria, and that's where he got that
Yeah,
from.
somebody else,
And
I think.
Citria, yeah, Citria is definitely working on that. So, but yeah, that it, but yeah, you're correct in the sense that there's other sort of like limits that it runs up against, and that's what's happening with
Yeah. And
with respect to transactions.
another thing that is related is there have been situations in the network where there was a policy and it basically became useless over time due to common practice. So I was on I don't know which side you guys were on with the first scene safe RBF. I was actually thinking leave first scene safe RBF alone. It's not so very secure, but if it works for some people, let them do it. And so there was a period where nodes were trying to kind of respect first scene, right? So if they see a transaction, they'll mine that. They won't mine a replacement unless you opt into RBF, and the kind of concepts evolved over time. But anyway, it seemed that the miners or something didn't agree. So at some point, it became so overwhelming that miners were running full RBF that the prospect of relying on it became ludicrous because 98% of the hash rate was applying full RBF. So you could, just broadcast any transaction to any miner through the peer-to-peer network, and it would, completely override the first scene safe choice. And so only, at the very end, when it had reached 98%, okay, the network has given up on this, usage pattern has changed, Bitcoin reference client's policy is obviously well out of date, did they get rid of it, right? And so that was an example of when they were very slow. Now, so I think it's relevant here because when the first pull request was nacked, I think at that point, 100 kilobyte op returns would generally not relay in the peer-to-peer network because there's very few nodes that would do it. But by the time of the second one, that had changed. So a lot of miners had started upping their what they would accept, and more nodes did. Probably the spammers had something to do with it. Probably Libre Relay had something to do with it. So Libre Relay is another kind of patch set or fork.
All right, Adam,
Yeah.
Adam, we need to there's
We
a
need to
lot
du-
of
Yep.
you're saying a lot of stuff that's like very insider and like Tone's audience
Yeah,
definitely
unpack it,
needs
yeah,
to
unpack it. But I'm just
we need
saying that.
to we need to dumb
So
this
the
down for me.
yeah. Well, I mean, the high level, what I was getting at is like with full RBF, when network conditions change, you can get to a situation where it makes sense to say, well, that's not the way it works anymore. That's not what the users are doing. That's not how the network's behaving. So I guess we should, you know, change the policy to match reality, because if policy doesn't match reality, it has other side effects, right? And so there's an argument to be made that this was the case for what, because people will say, why did it get nacked earlier this year? And why did it get axed now? What changed? And they're like, conspiracies, nothing changed. Why did you do it? But actually something did change, which is the things that would get relayed into the network. And I spoke to somebody who said they did some test transactions without any, special connectivity, just with a listening node. And they're able to get 7 different 100 kilobyte op return test transactions mined in the next block, without direct, just in the peer-to-peer network, right? So that's to say by somewhere, this summer, the network conditions changed. Now, of course, there are people who have opinions that might be helping the network conditions change for some reason. If they have a policy view and they think something needs to change, they'll do it. It's not entirely clear why miners were running full RBF in force before, but it happened, right? So there's something happening in the network. And so that's an argument for why it got nacked before and why it got axed now. And, people have different opinions about the weightings of what happened in there.
All right, Jimmy,
But
jump
maybe you
in.
want to explain
I'm
details.
gonna go. I'm gonna go fill up a water bottle, and when I come back, I'm gonna have questions that are right at the center of the controversy.
All right.
So
Well,
go for it.
let's back up a little bit, and let's talk about what Libre really is and stuff like that. Because I don't know if Tone's audience necessarily knows what that is
No, they
or
won't.
why it was created and how it actually works. And obviously, Adam, you and I know what percolation threshold means and stuff like that. And
Yeah, I mean, actually,
like
it would be
who
useful.
controls based on like the intolerant
Yeah,
or the tolerant minority and things
yeah,
like that.
maybe start
Those are all
there.
concepts that we have to sort of build up to. But let's
Yeah,
start
yeah.
with Libre
Start
Relay
with
and what it is.
Well, maybe start with a tolerant minority, because that is a
Uh,
general peer-to-peer network, nothing to do with Libre Relay, right? And then Libre
mhm,
Relay is a kind of custom client that amplifies the effect, let's say.
mhm. So all right. So let's describe what tolerant minority means. So, the Bitcoin peer-to-peer network, hopefully this makes sense, is a gossip network. That means that every node basically talks about every other transaction and block that it knows. And that's how it's designed, because if you have a new block, for example, you want the rest of the network to know about it so that they can build on top of it and so on, and know the current state of the Bitcoin blockchain and so on. But so that it's a gossip network. Now, standardness is basically what transactions you are willing to relay to others, right? So these are the rules around, hey, I received this transaction from somebody else, and I am willing to relay it to other peers that I have. And this is very different than what actually goes into a block, because the rules on what transactions are allowed to go into a block are generally looser than what is actually standard. So, for example, there's a minimum transaction output limit. So, if you're spending some Bitcoin, um, there's a field that the amount that you're sending to a particular address has to meet some minimum for those transactions to be relayed by most nodes. And this is like 546, I think, for pay to pub key hash, something like that, Satoshis, in order for those transactions to go be relayed. So this is standardness, and that's what that's different than what actually gets mined. Now, those are the limits around what nodes actually transmit. So there's some limits to sort of gossiping, right? Like what you're willing to transmit to other nodes. What you receive is what you receive, but what you give to other nodes is what we call sort of standardness. These are um, the transactions that you're willing to relay, and those two things are very different. Now, it turns out that with respect to the tolerant minority, which Adam is keen on explaining here, is that if you have just something like some 10% of nodes that are willing to transmit a particular type of transaction, then the entire network is going to know about it, whether even if 90% of the network isn't willing to transmit some of those. So this is what we call the tolerant minority. So as long as you get 10% of nodes that are willing to transmit something, then the entire network will more or less know about that transaction just because of the 10%, the tolerant minority that are willing to transmit it. So I don't know why Adam went offline, but hopefully I kind of explained that correctly. Adam, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, no, I'm listening. Yeah, could move on
Okay.
to the
Libre relay nodes. I guess we're explaining Libre relay nodes. So Libre relay is basically a fork of Bitcoin Core that Peter Todd made to essentially be the tolerant minority, and they are willing to transmit all kinds of stuff that normal Bitcoin Core nodes and NOTS nodes and other nodes previous to version 30 were not willing to transmit. So, for example, it had op return outputs that were greater than 80 that it was willing to transmit, which wasn't allowed or wasn't standard after core before core 30. And it also started relaying transactions that were less than 1 sat per vbyte, all the way down to 0.1 sat per vbyte. And it was willing to do that. And I think it showed that you could, when you have a tolerant minority, it'll get to most nodes. The transaction will be known by most nodes, and miners started mining a lot of those. For example, less than 1 sat per vbyte transactions, and that's something that Libre Relay essentially made because they're the tolerant minority. So that's a soft fork of, I mean, that's not a soft fork. That's a fork of the Bitcoin Core software that Peter Todd made to sort of demonstrate that.
All right. So on that note, let's talk about some of the controversies. So I am as layman as it gets. I've been around Bitcoin enough. I have a bit of a technical background, which is why the shows you and I did during the 2017 fork wars were so popular, Jimmy. So let's start with the good. Can you explain why this current controversy is nothing like the 2017 scare that there was going to be a fork, right? So in the big picture, it doesn't really matter. This is not something that's gonna like break Bitcoin apart, and some nodes will run these things, some will not. But how is this nothing like the 2017 disaster?
Well, so I'll state the difference very plainly in the sense that one, back in 2017, we were headed towards like a chain fork and not a code fork. Those are two different things, right? The chain fork in this case was with backwards compatible changes and backwards incompatible changes. A block size increase would have been backwards incompatible, or straight block size increase would have been backwards incompatible. Whereas SegWit was backwards compatible. So one was a soft fork, one was a hard fork, and that did cause
Sorry,
a
you're
chain
breaking
split. That did cause a chain split back in 2017 with Bitcoin Cash versus Bitcoin. it has nothing to do with consensus. These are
Wait, Jimmy, you're
standardness.
breaking up. Hold on.
Okay. All right. Is it better? Yeah, because
Actually,
you're
I
frozen
hear
on my.
Jimmy fine. It
I'm
might
getting
be
a
you,
lag.
Tone.
I
I
think it
can
might
hear
be
Jimmy
you
okay.
because your screen is frozen for me. I don't
It
know
might be
how
me.
your internet. Yeah.
It was working fine earlier. I am here in Panama. It looks like you're back. Can you just repeat a couple of things?
Yeah.
I was
So,
like, I'm back.
2017, you had you had a chain split. So you had two different blockchains as a result of the Bitcoin Cash hard fork, for example. Uh, this one has nothing to do with consensus. This is about standardness or what nodes are willing to relay, and not about what is legal or illegal in a block. So though that's why it's like very materially different in that whatever node you run, the consensus rules are still the same, right? Like you're still making sure that they're under 4 virtual megabytes, I guess, of size for each block. You're making sure of a lot of other SIGOPs and other consensus checks and so on. But standardness is what's different, and that's materially different. Now, like there are actually people that are saying this could be the end of Bitcoin and so on, and you'll probably have some of them on your show. So I don't want to like make it sound like there's nothing to worry. Like everyone is saying there's nothing to worry about. I personally don't think it's too much to worry about because we still have other spam mitigation limits within Bitcoin. But that said, I don't want to misrepresent what other people are saying because for some people, it really is sort of like an existential dilemma for Bitcoin because of the increase in attack surface from governments and so on. So I don't want to dismiss that, but like this is where the controversy is within standardness and not in consensus. Consensus means that you have a chain split and so on, and where this controversy has nothing to do with consensus so far.
All right, that was a very, very good explanation. And yes, I will have some of those people on, probably part two, and then we may go a little more neutral in part three. So now I'm coming at this from like a layman's person point of view. We were during those 2017 fork wars, we easily knew who the bad guys were, who the good guys were. That's what people are asking right now. Who are the good guys? Who are the bad guys? And in this case, there really aren't any, right? Both sides think that they are doing what's better for Bitcoin, and the community is deciding. But I will add that when the Taproot upgrade was coming as a soft fork, uh, from what I saw, and again, after Taproot, I kind of mentally checked out of what is going on in Bitcoin, but I do hear stuff. And since Taproot, I think has brought on a lot more annoyance and more spam, all this ordinals, all this crap into the Bitcoin blockchain, and all of the benefits of Taproot that it was going to be so great. I haven't felt those or heard about those much or seen it. And basically, my non-professional opinion after Taproot was it really necessary? Because it felt like it created more problems and more debates and more controversy than the benefits that Taproot actually brought. Now, maybe Adam could, prove me or like state the opposite right now, because this leads into the next question. If the community feels that Taproot has brought on more nuisance than benefits to Bitcoin, the financial network, this is like Taproot on steroids, according to the same people that now feel kind of cheated by Taproot's promises. So maybe Jimmy, you want to weigh in on this first, and then Adam.
Well, I already made a video about I like questioning whether all of the promises of Taproot were like warranted, and my view has been that we're supposed to get a lot of different things, and I was as guilty as anybody else in sort of like promoting a lot of the benefits of Taproot, but it's exactly like you said. A lot of those benefits we're not seeing. In fact, like something like 90% of UTXOs that are using paid Taproot are spam, right? Like they're like obviously using BRC20 or inscriptions or ordinals or something like that. And they're all just sort of like most of the Taproot outputs are like that, and we do kind of have to question, okay, where are the benefits? And I'm still open to there being a lot of different benefits. Arc is a really cool project that's completely impossible without Taproot. BitVM again is a project that's completely impossible without Taproot, and maybe those scale Bitcoin in ways that we haven't thought of. In fact, there's a lot of evidence that like something like Arc can like supercharge Lightning essentially, because you can use that, and BitVM can bring all kinds of interesting capabilities in terms of like smart contracts and so on. So there's like it's still an open question, at least in my mind, that and maybe we do need to wait 5-10 years before we see a lot of the user benefits of Taproot. But so far, I think what you said, Tone, is kind of correct, that if you have 90% of Taproot outputs be essentially spam, then we should be asking, okay, like, was that a good thing to do in the first place? Were we not as vigilant as we should have been as users, and asking sort of more questions about like what it was supposed to be about? Like that's I think kind of legitimate to be asking, and we'll see. But I mean, I'd like to hear what Adam has to say about whether Taproot was that a good thing or a bad thing, or like what do you think?
Yeah.
You heard
Well,
you heard my speech, right, Adam?
uh, I mean, I was listening along. Yeah.
Okay. I just wasn't sure
Yeah.
You heard what I had to
No,
say.
no, I
Okay,
just had the video
great.
off. Yeah.
Okay.
So I think the, I mean, the question about new transaction formats getting used is something that InstaGibs, Greg Sanders,
Mhm.
talked about on Tales from the Crypt recently, which is to say that they have generally done the work on the new transaction type, like with SegWit or now with Taproot, and then the work on the wallet, which is to say the kind of embedded wallet, the wallet libraries, the formats and standards for making a wallet out of it, like PSBT and all this thing, that has tended to come later. And so you get this kind of phenomena where people get kind of hyped up, like Taproot is coming, and there were lots of people kind of talking about all the amazing things it was going to do, but then actually there was a lull because, as I understand it, the PSBTs and the wallets and the music and all this stuff was still in development, right? So what InstaGibs was saying is like, well, in the future, maybe we should make sure that all the wallet stuff is ready to go before we even activate the thing. And having that ready to go might inform design a little bit too, right? Because you might run into something you didn't predict while you're doing it. Then that's one topic. Now, in terms of the discount, I think that would apply to SegWit also. Somebody could do an inscription like trick with SegWit in probably smaller chunks or something, and get the same discount with P2WSH or P2SH or what have you. Well, P2, yeah, either of those. The witness version, right? So probably P2WSH and variants. And so, and and then people were saying, you know, people look at correlation and think it's causality, and so they're like, well, Taproot is a bug, that meme, right? I'm like, well, what's the bug? I'm like, well, it has a discount. Yeah, I mean, the Taproot came in 2021. SegWit came in 2017. The discount's been there since 2017. The actual correlation, I believe, was the altcoin bear market, the winter for alts in 2021, 2022, and at the same time, Trammell VC, so Dustin Trammell's an early miner, he has a VC fund, and they put out a report saying that, VC has dropped off a cliff for altcoin projects, but VC funding for Bitcoin layer 2 has doubled this year. And so, there used to be like 3 or 4 Bitcoin layer 2s, and now there are 30. And if you pick them apart, most of them are actually literally rebranded altcoins that call themselves layer 2s of Bitcoin.
Mhm.
And so I think that was the trigger. And so then, of course, they bought all the silly altcoin use cases with them, but on Bitcoin as a differentiator, right? So the NFTs and the meme coins. So, and you got to distinguish between whether it's Taproot or not, because some of these don't actually use Taproot. Like I think a lot of the sort of meme coin carriers, like BRC20 runes and things, are probably not actually using Taproot because they can make do with 80 bytes basically, or other things. People complain about the wastefulness of some of them, so some of them are worse than others. The main thing that's wasteful in effect is that from BitMEX research, Johnny Beer's data, who went through and collected, how big was this spam wave since 2023? It's like 105 million transactions, and 3.5 million of those were images, mostly Taproot, and the average image size is 10 kilobytes, which is quite interesting in itself. That's not that big for an image. That suggests, turning up the compression ratio and relatively low resolution. So they may be sensitive to fees after all, which is interesting. And then the rest are, I think, not really, SegWit discount related. So my contention is that, saying Taproot is a bug is kind of a bit wrong because it's, they're sort of saying the witness is the bug, or, that the size of the field, that the sort of the maximum segment of code in Taproot is bigger. But I think ultimately it doesn't matter, if you limited it to 500 bytes or whatever, they would just make more segments, right? And they're even like image spam going back before SegWit that just used tons and tons of op return. And Mike in Space has some kind of intentionally optimally bad image encoding just to, I don't know, tweak people. Which is stamps, right? So that's using lots of fake pub keys. So I think the upshot for Bitcoin is, yeah, they're able to get, a discount for the images. I think it's not actually, I saw that the claim is 25 basis points or something. So no, less, I think 2.5 basis points. So ultimately the spam may not have been that big a proportion of the blocks. I saw Udi claimed that they made 30 blocks worth of spam images during the 2 years or however long it was. And if you do the math, it came out to like something tiny, like I forgot the numbers, but it was pretty small, right? Because there's a lot of blocks in a 2-year period compared to 30.
All right.
And so it's not that big. And then the other point is the cost though is probably more on the meme coins because all these things got rug pulled obviously because they're scams, and so they left a ton of unspent UTXOs that they're probably never going to spend because they had, dust level value. I don't know if they're available to a wallet. It's probably some kind of website thing, right? Where maybe the user doesn't even have the key. Who knows, right? So it's kind of that drag because people are saying, "Oh, look at the UTXO set. Look how many UTXOs there are." And technically, the Taproot inscription is not as bad as it sounds for the UTXO because the way they do it is the image is in the signature. They make a massive signature or a massive witness. And so it's spent. And when it's spent, it doesn't live in the UTXO set anymore, right? So actually that is kind of UTXO pruned automatically in a way, but it is more data. So, I think
So
ultimately,
Adam,
yeah,
so one thing that I want to point out that did happen with the Taproot upgrade was that for SegWit version 0, which is the 2017 soft fork, there was a 3600 byte witness program size limit for standardness, which wasn't configurable. It was sort of hard coded into the code. But in SegWit version 1, which is taproot, that restriction was eliminated. I believe it's documented in BIP 340 or 341. So it really did actually expand the amount of inscription that you can put in. So you can't do a 10 kilobyte um, large witness program in SegWit version 0, at least without going directly to a
Right.
miner or something like that. So that it's
No, well,
but like it was standard in version 1, so that's what the spammers ended up using. So just wanted to make that
yeah,
part.
right. But I mean, I think there is a kind of logical fallacy that people get stuck in that, um, let's take the example. I believe the push data limit in Taproot is 520 bytes or something. I'm not sure. Anyway, there's sort of some field, right? And so let's
Mhm.
say hypothetically we say that's too big. We don't like that. People are abusing it for spam. Now, presumably it's written so that people can do, more complicated scripts to do more interesting, uh, you know, let's say covenant-like things or discrete log contracts or whatever it is they're doing, right? So in any case, let's say we don't like that and people will argue, let's halve it. I'm like, do you really think that's going to make any difference? You're just going to get twice as many extents and the overhead's going to go up slightly. And so actually the person that, that makes things generally doing that makes things worse for nodes, right? If you have 100 kilobyte limit, I mean, it's actually in their policy, but let's say that 100 kilobyte limit became a soft fork limit. So it's actually enforced on hot returns. Now say that you say, oh, it's too much. Let's drop it to 1 kilobyte. Okay, but does it stop the spam, or do they just send 100 op returns? If it's 100 op returns spread across, 100 output, 100 UTXO outputs, that's actually even worse, right? So every time people have the intuition that they're going to make things better by limiting fields and sort of making things less flexible, putting tighter sanity limits on it, they're actually making things slightly worse. And as you kind of, if you go through the sort of scorched earth thought experiment of what is the optimal thing we could do to kill spam, right? And you just get extreme just to make the point, right? So you're like, okay, we're going to deprecate taproot, period. No more taproot. No more SegWit, no more SegWit discount, no more op returns. We're going to get rid of all of them, right? And we're going to somehow navigate the situation that we're not going to trap anybody's funds while doing it. And of course, we've made it difficult to do a lot of stuff, right? Now, maybe Lightning becomes hard because you don't have the malleability fix and a bunch of stuff will break basically. But let's say hypothetically we did it because people are mad about spam. They illustrate by showing the best you could do if you didn't care about the consequences. And what are the spammers going to do? Do you think they're going to go, oh, well, never mind, we'll walk away from $1 million a day fee business? Or will they just do the mic and space thing of clog up, hundreds of thousands of fake pub keys and carry right on,
Right.
right?
Okay. Let me
So
jump.
really, this is more of a social feeling, right?
Right.
Well, so
Go for it.
Adam, I mean, what you're saying makes sense and everything, but I think the bigger point that Tone is making
Yeah,
is that with Taproot, you had this increase from 3600 byte witness to an unlimited, essentially unlimited, at least on that side. There are other restrictions and so on, which made it possible for you to inscribe large inscriptions and still have it relayed by the network. And that's one of the things that I think Luke put in a PR to let's put it back down so that we don't have to have these large inscriptions, and that was rejected. You mentioned Mike in Space and his stamps protocol, which uses bare multisig with
yeah, that's just
I think
ludicrous, isn't it?
pub keys, like pub keys that don't have a private key, or even pub keys that aren't even points on the ECDS elliptic curve and so on. But like those are that there was another pull request, at least in Bitcoin, that said, hey, let's not make let's no longer make bare multisig standard.
Yeah,
And that was rejected like a couple of years ago, despite the fact that this was clearly detrimental to the UTXO set. So I
Are
think
you
what a lot of people,
sure? I mean, I think that, usually the hesitancy to nuke something is if there's any value trapped in it, right? Because that would like lock the value unless you did something. But
I
in any
think
case, I don't think it
spending it is fine. It's the
create
creation
new
of
ones.
new ones.
Yeah,
Yeah,
okay.
that
So I
was
don't know
part
about
of
that, but I
the
mean,
appeal.
I think I want to focus on the bigger picture though, because it's easy to get trapped in the recriminations about history, which is like really down in the weeds. And, we might be wrong either way. I don't know. But my point is, usually there's an argument on both sides of those things. But my point is, look, even if the bare pub keys were got rid of, there's things we can't get rid of. Like, you know,
I
public keys in
I
general, hashes in general, right? And
I don't
microspaces
think anyone
encoding
is
works on them.
disputing that,
Right.
right? And
Right. But it
it's
also
obvious that you
applies to
can't
what you
put
were
in random data, right?
Also,
right.
Adam,
But
try to answer it quick because I have many more. I have a follow up on this, and then I have several more questions, please.
yeah. Well, I think the other point, Jimmy, is that the same would apply to what you were saying about the taproot, you know, code size limit or something. Like
Mm-hmm.
having that be 3,600 bytes instead of 10K bytes or whatever it is, it doesn't really make that much difference. They're just going to use 3 times more outputs or 3 times more transactions or something, right?
I think it might be a transaction limit. So you
Oh,
can't
then they
do
make
more
three
than
transactions, right?
yeah. I mean, they
I mean,
might,
there's a
but
hundred. Yeah.
in which case it
Like I
would
think
cost more, right? Like that's I mean that's I think the
not
point.
much, not much,
Let me
right? Like the overhead is pretty small on that kind of size. If it costs a few extra bytes for,
let me come at
three
it.
was one.
Guys, let me come at it from another angle, right? Adam, it sounds like I understand your point in that because I remember like Luke Jur wanted to lower the block size limit to like 250 megabytes, 250
Two,
kilobytes from a megabyte. And
Yeah.
I see your point is like, well, if you're lowering the block size, then the spammers will have an easier time like filling up that space. So now the reverse is, well, if we have no limit, I mean, it doesn't matter. Now the spammers have away. So my counter argument to that is there's a big difference between filling up and spamming, let's say the block size did get lowered to 250 kilobytes, it would be completely obvious that it's spam. But when you reverse it, now the spammers are pretending like they're running a valid business, right? Like these stamps and ordinals and all this other garbage. Now they get to pretend that it's a viable product while spamming the blockchain versus if they don't have versus if we do limit the amount of shit you can stick into the protocol, it would be impossible for them to claim that they are running a valid business. I would love to hear your answer to this.
I mean, that's a kind of social question, right? Because they used to, before SegWit, they used to use, I don't know, fake pub keys. I think Mike in Space might have done something even worse intentionally, but
yeah, that
the
was the bare multisig. Yeah, he
yeah.
put them into
Right.
the
I mean,
pub keys of
they're
a bare
trolls. It's
multisig.
like him and Udi
I
and the
mean,
rest of them.
actually, I think Mike in Space didn't do many of them, and it was kind of a prank to make a point. It's kind of a meta joke or something, actually. But in any case,
No,
it
no,
shows,
it's still going
even.
on. I think, if
Oh,
I'm
what
not
people are using
mistaken.
it? Okay, so
Yeah.
it's yeah. So anyway, I think that people's inclination is they want to have a victory against the spammers, even if it's a Pyrrhic victory, i.e., that you got a burglar trying to break into your house, but you basically trash your house, and you're like, well, you got rid of the burglar, but the house is kind of trashed, right? So, there's something like that going on here, right? Which is that each thing we do to like combat them, to reduce their credibility, to make them non-standard, it's chipping away at decentralization typically. Because if you one problem is, and Jimmy hinted at this, right, that if the filters start to work, and I mean, I'd argue they're probably not going to work because of the tolerant minority factor, which is actually about censorship resistance, right? It's so that the unpopular minority can get the transaction to miners. But let's say it did work, and that's some of the filter proponents' point is that, well, maybe it'll work a bit. And let's say it worked enough to impact the revenue for the miners and the spammers, then they do what they did before, right? Which is they go back to direct submission, they start using Fiber again, that thing that Matt Corella did. Somebody was posting it yesterday that Fiber is coming back, like somebody's working on it. So, okay, preemptively doing it. I wasn't expecting that so fast. And or private peering, and then the nodes lose any agency in nudging what's happening because all the stuff they might have a view about is going direct, and that has side effects too, right? Because if it's more centralized into miners, now the bigger miners get the fees, the smaller miners maybe are not in the click, so they don't get the transactions. It makes it harder to have competition. More centralized mining is bad. At the beginning, we said that Datum is good, and I agree. And there's Tron V2. There's a few projects trying to do this. I think that's good, but it's sort of separate. There's two issues, two factors. They're both, centralization is bad, and there are different ways we get there, right? So it seems to me, from looking at it, that there's some kind of inherent conflict between censorship resistance and being able to fight spam. Like the fact that the network is decentralized and it's hard to censor actually makes it hard to filter. And there's another similar one between privacy and the ability to filter for spam. So if Bitcoin had some significantly improved privacy, then the nodes and the miners wouldn't have the information to even distinguish spam from non-spam, right? They wouldn't be able to tell like a big change consolidation transaction from an image.
And you're leading me into my next question, right? So Bitcoin Core was already under some scrutiny. I mean, Roger Ver kind of started the ball rolling on, Bitcoin Core. It was infiltrated and all that stuff. And that kind of, bad cloud, already was over Core. And the taproot, as we explained earlier, that didn't help matters. And as someone commented, this current controversy, it is not increasing Bitcoin's privacy. It is I wanna give credit to the person that wrote it. It is not increasing Bitcoin's privacy. It is clearly not increasing Bitcoin's security either. It is not enhancing Bitcoin's monetary benefits. So why is Core fighting so hard for this? And it just doesn't make any sense. And hence, all of these rumors are now being jacked up on steroids. Has Core been compromised? Or are they like just too many shitcoiners? Do they want Bitcoin to be more like Ethereum? I mean, these are legitimate criticisms of Core. And on my personal level, I was kind of taken away when I heard that Core was now like editing code to be like, SJW, more gender neutral or whatever the hell they were changing the wording in the Core. Like, like that's kind of when the pendulum started to swing a little bit. So how do you reply to these criticisms that I honestly have to say they're pretty warranted in this case?
No, I mean, taking aside that blacklist thing, which I thought was retarded, frankly, whoever did
Agreed.
that, the I think it's perfectly simple. When I got into this a couple of weeks ago, I was pretty neutral. I wanted to understand what's going on. I reproduced the arguments for myself. So people saw me sort of flip-flopping, asking questions that are pushing each side, like why do you say this, why do you say that, and stuff. And ultimately, I think I was able to reproduce the arguments and say, there's no conspiracy necessary. We went through earlier. Jimmy explained the rationale for not wanting to have developers put data into fake pub keys. That's worse than putting it into op return. And they weren't asking, they weren't coming to Bitcoin developers and saying, can you increase op return? They were just going to calmly use fake pub keys, right? So they were happy doing that. And they had a reason for wanting to do that rather than putting it in TypeScript, which is they wanted it, it's a kind of justice transactions. They wanted to relay quickly. So that makes them more sensitive, right? So to like standardness. And fake pub keys unfortunately are standard. They're hard to detect ultimately. So I think that's your simple explanation right there. And then the thing that, took me a while to say, well, wait a minute, but why 100 kilobytes? Like why not 160 or 144 or whatever the limit is, right? And I think the argument there is that basically, look, it's firstly what we said a little bit earlier, which is this feature was NAC'd early this year and ACT more recently, like the Bitcoin 30 release. And that was because the network conditions changed. So the miners had changed their policy. The miners are spied in the network. There's lots of nodes, enough nodes, evidently, either in a Libre relay or custom configuration, that the transactions were getting through at 100 kilobytes. So, when that's happening, what you set on your node doesn't really do that much because it's happening in the network anyway. So from that point of view, that's one thing. Having a low policy doesn't change anything. And then the other point is, if you have 100 kilobytes, they're probably not going to use it because it's 4 times cheaper, they in taproot inscriptions. And even if they used it, it's less bad. They're going to pay 4 times as much, and they're only going to be able to send 4 times less data per block. That reduces the node overhead. So like those 3 arguments together kind of explain it. I thought that, okay, and I can understand the logic, but it would be socially smarter, let's say, to set it to 160 because it more closely mirrors the 40 bytes, then 80 bytes drama. When that changed, I guess the 2014 was probably, I'm not sure exactly when the 80 came, but you look it up. But anyway, it mirrors the same thing, right? People are using fake pub keys. It's bad. We can't talk them out of it. Let's give them somewhere else to put it. Now you run into the very same problem again, which is they're back to using fake pub keys because 80 bytes wasn't enough for their justice transaction. And they want to send it in a blockchain. Robin Linus was explaining this, and he's a Bitcoin guy, right? He's not a shitcoiner. And he was saying the problem is they can't stick it on another network because they need the proof of publication for the justice transaction. So there's, you can use it as a dispute resolution, basically. You need it in the blockchain so you can refer to it somehow within scripts, I guess. And so that's why, right? So no conspiracy needed. And then there's a lot of false narratives piled up on top of this, right? Because there's not that much communication with developers. The people are saying like, well, the developers are socialist or not capitalist. And like, the developers actually, ironically, are the people saying, look, the best spam control we have is actually the fees, which is a free market kind of argument, right?
Right,
So
no one debates that, right? Like no one debates that fees are the best spam control, but at the
yeah,
same time, I mean, we've had something that is working, and this is where one of my favorite tweets of all time was during the covenants debate when Mr. Hodel tweeted out, "Stop fucking with my money." And can't why couldn't it have just been left? And maybe if it was just a move from 80 kilobytes to 160, and then we would have seen, will that have any effects? But even that is a slippery slope. It's kind of like saying, well, there is water leaking through my ceiling, and it's leaking in a ceiling in a room where I don't really care about. So why do I even need a ceiling, right? Instead of patching up the holes. And yes, it's a bit of a cat and mouse game of stopping the spammers, and it's a little bit annoying to play cat and mouse to stop the spammers. But like a solution to, well, instead of playing cat and mouse with the spammers, let's just let the fees solve the problem. I mean, there could be infinite amount of unforeseen consequences with this, and it feels like Core isn't taking that side seriously enough and just, sticking
but
to its guns of we don't need this and it should have never been there in the first place. Which in a way, I'm sorry, which in a way sounds like the Bcacher debate. Well, originally there was no 1 megabyte block, so why do we need it now? I mean, this is kind of
I
what it
mean,
sounds like on the surface. Am I wrong, Jimmy?
mm, I'll be hesitant to like label it because each person has got their own logic and then they emphasize with the winning side of previous arguments, like about COVID hysteria. People looking at it from a logic point of view are saying, wow, the people that are pro filters sound like they've got, spam hysteria, right? And there's a lot of vitriol coming out. Of course, a lot of it's confused because it's very technical. But like that's also not fair, right? Because I know some of these people, they are, they have genuine concerns. And the, so I think what you said there, Tone, was like one part of it was coming off the rails, which is, what do you think, if you're saying core should have done something or should have not done something, like what could they do, right? I mean, it's exactly mirroring the 2014 introduction of op return, which is somebody is wasting, doing fake pub keys, which is worse than doing op return. So it's the same thing, right? The op return size limit was actually counterproductive because it was creating an incentive for people to use fake pub keys again because of this use case, right? Because of the BitVM design limit, the limit that they couldn't make a smaller proof, basically.
All right, so in that case, right, then why is, let's say, your biggest proponents, or I'm not looking for the right word, your biggest detractors, right, which is Luke Jur, who, by the way, I'm never gonna forget when you and I had maybe it was a private conversation, I don't remember, over dinner or something, where you have a lot of respect for Luke Jur, and you were even like defending him when he was a consultant paid by Blockstream to basically just sit there in a corner, listen, and maybe once a year, like say something brilliant, like, hey, Segwit could be a soft fork. So why do they think that this is going to destroy Bitcoin? And they have such strong feelings about it. And I'm not sure what Knott's nodes are doing with the op returns at the moment. So they clearly think that the current status quo is, keep it as is, because why do they feel that this is going to destroy Bitcoin? Why such a huge divide where you don't think this is a big deal at all, and they think it's the death of the protocol, and somehow like you guys don't take their views seriously. Maybe they're over exaggerating, but even so, don't they have a point at all, or no?
Well, I mean, I think they are doing a number of things that are kind of silly, actually, like blocking the lightning pinning fix, and they are, blocking a few things which are really sort of pedantic and not like logically defensible, I would say. And so that, that's not to say that people don't have concerns, because I think one lesson from the speedy trial experience is that, you can have a situation where people are concerned about different things and they don't agree about each other's concerns. They're like, that's not a real concern. Well, that concern doesn't make any sense to me. And in the speedy trial, there were three competing views, and none of them thought the other two concerns were particularly important, or they thought one of them was mediocre and the other one made no sense or something. And so ultimately, they were able to get to a form of rough consensus where, you try to address the concerns of all parties, even though nobody agreed on what the weighting of the concerns was, right? So I think, you just ultimately get to a situation sometimes where you got to consider, if you're trying to fix something, that the side effect is not worse than the problem you're trying to address, right? And that is arguably the case with with a lot of this filtering stuff, because either it doesn't work, or if it does work, the miners will react by making things more centralized. And it's not hypothetical, because like they've done it before, right? They've used private peering, they've used by mining, they've used uh, fiber. Apparently, fiber is making a comeback. So it's coming back, and as soon as you have that, then the nodes are not even involved in the relaying, right? so they don't have a nudge influence anymore. So I think that's it really. There's a lot more detail, of course. One of the concerns with filtering, because there's another whole drama we didn't get into, which is somebody leaked some instant message, like signal messages Luke was having with looked like a zero knowledge proof kind of expert or researcher. And uh, that, and there he seemed to be saying that he was, think transaction out data should be deleted basically. And then he was trying to work out a zero knowledge proof so you could have the hash of the data, prove some things about it, and then use that to still verify the block without having the data so they could delete it. And so I think there is a case where you don't want it as no kind of ability to selectively delete and filter transactions intentionally. And there is a precedent in peer-to-peer systems. I implemented a couple of peer-to-peer systems in the 90s. Well, one in the 90s, one in the early 2000s, and ran exit nodes, like remailers and Tor exit nodes and peer-to-peer file sharing. And there's always like a risk in these things because like those networks don't exist if volunteers don't run them, right? And so because of that, there are a bunch of court cases where, individuals that were unfortunate enough to get targeted by the Motion Picture Association and all those guys, or, by various law enforcements because somebody sent them a hot for a remailer or a Tor exit, then they had to get the EFF to defend them. And the governments were always trying to ban encryption and, they didn't like self-sovereignty. And so ultimately through these fights, there were some reasonably positive defensive things that protect, software, hardware, and people, run servers like miners, nodes, things like that. And one of the principles is evident in something people are more familiar with probably, which is the Apple versus FBI case, where FBI was trying to get Apple to decrypt something, and Apple said, well, our hardware doesn't allow it. The firmware in the hardware doesn't allow it. And of course, the FBI wanted them to change it, change the firmware. And there is some doctrine, and this has been tested in about 60 different cases. So it's a well-established protective doctrine that if your system doesn't have a way to do something, they can't really force you to do it. It's kind of like connected with free speech and compelled action, stuff like that. But on the other hand, if you're unwise enough to go and implement that feature, or, people have been talking about implementing a plugin framework to, filter transactions, and Luke has been, or, the Ocean team has been reaching out to miners with legal opinions to say, you really should filter stuff. You should, join this committee, I guess. I don't know, like not all of it's public, but I was hearing things before that thing got leaked. And if you do that, that's really bad, right? That creates a lot of risk for Bitcoin in terms of its censorship resistance. So, the people are concerned about different risks. And, if you talk about this risk to a lot of the filter proponents, they're like, I don't believe it. Oh, that doesn't sound right. Or they'll do the smart programmer thing and they will, oh yes, but I could do this. Or the FBI, the court would never say this. I'm like, dude, it's been there for decades and it's been tested in 60 cases. It's a thing. And CSU Wildcat on Twitter has been explaining this stuff and people like basically don't believe him, right? So I think it is a bit like speedy trial where there are people with legitimate, like hard concerns that are being overlooked or discounted because of the vitriol. And then the spam concern, actually that's shared by everybody apart from obviously the spam industry. And the last one, which we haven't talked about, is this, concern about very illegal content, like illegal images that are, can get you in trouble for having on your hard drive, basically, in a lot of countries. And the worry that that might land in a blockchain or somebody, a saboteur might do it, right? And so there was a 2018 report put out by some academics. There's some articles you can find online. There is some illegal content in there, but they're concerned that I know somehow the data carrier size is going to change that, even though most of the data is in taproot. Most of the images are in taproot inscriptions. And then they have this whole argument about whether it's contiguous or not. And, or that it's encouraging spam. And so you're complicit, all this kind of stuff, right? But in reality, Bitcoin is about financial transactions. Op return is about, anchors and layer two hashes and checksums and things. And the rest of the fields that are getting abused are about Bitcoin smart contracts for financial transactions, right? The Bitcoin script in SegWit and Taproot and natively. So it's true that people can hide stuff in there, but it's not like a file folder or an email attachment. It's like a bunch of bits you have to scrape out of, a massive collection of large binary files, and you have to basically be a programmer or use some tools written by a programmer to even find it. So one of the guys posted a link with a bunch of command line stuff, right, to extract a taproot image and an op return image, and it looked kind of similar. There's like a bunch of pipes and command line tools and JQs and like fragments of Bitcoin scripts in different formats, and so I think the argument is that there are actually other protections, which is another sort of thing that was built up over time, which is protection from you having some illegal content in your browser cache or in your email box. And that the basic test there is a sort of common sense thing that did you try to collect, did you solicit that data, did you go looking for it, did you download it, did you intend to open it, were you trying to find it, and or did you ever open it, right? And so if the answer to any of those things is no, they're generally going to say, okay, well, obviously that was just a result of some email spam that auto open that you didn't see, or something that was in your spam folder that you never opened and stuff like that, right? So there's a precedent for that too. But some people want to change a Bitcoin protocol to, I don't know what they want to do exactly, right? Delete stuff selectively. That sounds risky. But illegal content sounds risky,
Well,
and
so
that really triggers some
that was
people.
what the op return 2 discussion was about. But I think we're kind of getting into the weeds. I think the main things that I think that we should talk about are, one, the 100K versus 160, which I think Tone makes a good point. Like, why go to 100K when 160 will do for at least the use case that we know about? I guess you can say, hey, there might be other use cases that no one's talking about that would move over to op return or whatever. But I never really found that convincing. And hearing your explanation, I still don't really find that convincing that you need to go to 100K because the spammers are not going to hesitate to use fake pub keys or something like that. I also don't understand the multiple op return thing. That was a change as part of this pull request, where you're now allowing, instead of a single op return, that there's going to be multiple op returns. The answer I got from Greg Sanders is that there's maybe some people that would use sig hash anyone can pay combined with sig hash single to like sort of construct the transaction like piece by piece or something like that, and combine the signatures at some point to create multiple op returns where multiple people are putting it into the same transaction or something, which I've never really heard before. But I also don't find that convincing. And then there's
Well,
sort
like
of
that's
this last.
pretty harmless, though, right? I
No,
mean, what does it concern?
well, it first of all adds 9 bytes, and it doesn't really make sense. Like, why would
But
you
like,
do that, right?
I had a long conversation with somebody on Twitter where I'm still
Hmm.
not convinced they got it. But Luke had made this kind of misleading claim that because of the multiple op returns, 83 bytes would take 800 and was it,
30. Well,
yeah,
that's
like
if you use
830
like
bytes,
zero byte op returns, and you can
or
have
one byte per op return, right? Which is
yeah,
the
something like that.
minimum. And so I was like, well, that doesn't say it's inferior. That says you can waste space if you want to pay fees, but that's already implicit the case, right? You could, create I mean, to be silly, you could create a 999
Well,
like
I
99
get the
kilobyte
negative.
thing,
I get the negative
but like it
argument,
doesn't
right?
print
Like
anything, right?
it's not really changing anything, but why would you want to do that? I mean, the only reason that I can think of is so that spammers can spam more and have like extra outputs that
Well,
they're
actually, I
saying, hey,
mean,
this is an NFT or something. And now they
well,
can
that would
sell four
actually
NFTs with
be.
a single transaction or something.
I don't think
Like
so. I mean, I think
that's what it feels like.
that seems upside down, right? I mean, the filterers seem to be concerned about contiguous data. So a simple way to avoid contiguous data would be to submit a pull request to limit the individual op return to like 520, and then it would be chunked the same as the taproot one, right? Which and that would kind of answer their concern. So
I
you
mean,
know,
that's not my concern. I'm just wondering why you need multiple op returns.
I mean,
Like
you don't
when
have
you
to
can just
use
have a
it,
single
right?
one, like vast majority of
But
op
like,
returns, it's just like I don't
sure, but
understand why
like,
you need multiple and why it needs to go to
well, I mean,
100K and why you have zero point 0.1 sats per vbyte and all that stuff. They like none
well,
of
the
these
zero point
really
0.1
were.
sats is a different topic, right? That's about the sub one sat summer thing, which is
Mhm.
interesting. And actually, the sub one sat kind of makes the point that the Bitcoin developers are talking about, which is that that there's been a pattern here of the network behavior changing and the Bitcoin reference client catching up with that after the fact, right? So we talked about the full RBF. They didn't
Yeah, yeah.
update that
And
policy.
your argument
And
is that if the miners are mining it, then the rest of the network should reflect
well,
that for compact block relay and things like that. Is that
well, I mean,
reasonable?
the sub one sat was like is a very interesting case because all of the prior, I think, well, maybe there's some legacy stuff, but generally any recent, last 5 years, Bitcoin core client or NOTS client would have rejected sub one sat per vbyte, right? So it's
Hmm.
like pretty much unanimously. So that's as good as you can get in terms of sort of nudge factor, right? And yet, there are people on Twitter, and I know the handles who said, "Oh yeah, I participate in that. I helped meme that into reality." So I think what they figured is like, well, Bitcoin price is a lot higher now than it was when this limit was set. I have a lot of small change outputs that are expensive to consolidate. I want to consolidate them. So they got together and, change the configuration on their nodes and talk to some miners, and it started working, right? Initially not very reliably, but presumably more reliably when they got over some threshold or if they added some, I think the miners are probably, they're hungry for transactions, right? So they're probably cranking up their node parameters and making it work better than you'd expect. And anyway, so that was like pretty much organic. And then, that's another change in Bitcoin 30, which is to basically match what's happening in the network because it was pretty extreme. Like between 10%
Well,
and 50% of transactions in blocks were like sub one sat. So compact blocks was like failing hard at that point, right?
right. So, but I guess I'm asking more a conceptual, higher level question, which is that
Mm-hmm.
is Bitcoin Core the purpose to reflect what the miners are mining? Because miners might mine lots of other things. I think I put out a tweet earlier today. Mononaut saw a transaction come through where you had a bunch of one sat outputs, right? I think you had like 10 of them in
Yeah, I
this
saw that one.
particular transaction. And he's like, okay, well, the dust limit filter is cooked. That's what he said. And I asked a question, which is if one SAT outputs become more common, is the next version of Core going to remove the dust filter? Because according to that same logic, then compact block relay is no longer going to be reliable if they're doing a lot of those. And if the idea is to conform to centralized miners, this excludes, by the way, all the decentralized miners that are on the peer-to-peer network because they're not doing that because they don't get these transactions, right? They're not on the Libre
Well,
relay specific things. So what like
yeah.
is that what's going to happen? Are we always going to follow the centralized miners or is it like a one-off? Like what because that for me is at the heart of the issue. Are we following the centralized miners or are they going to be following us? Because eventually, and I hope you agree, we want to be in a decentralized mining world where most of the we don't know where the miners are or who's making these block templates at least. And they're all sort of spread through the P2P network, and that's how all these blocks are made. So we don't necessarily want to empower them more, but this seems to be doing the opposite, which is we're saying, okay, whatever you mine, we're going to conform to, because that's that's going to hurt compact block relay, as if that's a sort of main priority. Now, if that's the case, I can totally understand that point of view. I get that. But is that what Core is aiming to do, or the people on the Core side? Like, is that a fair description of
Great point, Jimmy.
what it
Great
is?
point. Great question.
I'm not sure that's accurate. I mean, I think it probably depends on the situation, but the
I mean, you just said that for subsat transactions.
Yeah, no, I mean, but I think that's a good case, right? Which is, it wasn't just centralized miners, because like ultimately, if we go back to the block size war, that was saying not only do we not necessarily care what miners say, but if miners fight us, we override them, right? They're service providers. And so clearly not, right? But it's, you've got to bear in mind the miners are a service provider. It's more the users. So if the users are memeing something into assistance, like widely using it, and it's not, I mean, they're just doing something economically rational. They want to do it. If the node software fights that, that's maybe not a good thing, right? So I think that's more of the concept.
But I mean, you're basically arguing then that if the miners are mining these, and because as far as I know,
no, it's a combination
until
right?
Core 29.1, like no non-Libre relay client actually relayed subsat transactions.
I think
Libre
it
relay.
wasn't right. I think it wasn't even Libre relay. I think it was users just changing their configuration. You'd recognize the handle if I sent it to you, because it doesn't take that many of them. You were saying earlier on that it's like 10% or something, but I mean, it starts working a bit below that. Just not
it
fast.
starts working really well if you know where the miners are. If you have centralized miners, you can just send it to them, right? Like
right,
as long as you're connected.
But that's different. I think that's a different test though, right? Because if people are going to a private submission API.
Oh no, not even private submission. This is what
you mean you could
peering
just
with Libre relay
your
was
node.
doing. Yeah,
yeah. Well, I mean, you need a miner to be, because there are lots of things enforced by the peer-to-peer network in terms of policy that neither users or miners, I mean, somebody who's trying to scam something might want to do it, but generally the miners will block it and most users won't do it because it's harmful. Like, the fees themselves, that's a policy. And the, the security features like, the soft fork upgrade hooks, right? The the op trues that are going to be used in future are non-standard until after the soft fork activates. And the Lightning v3 signatures, that package relay stuff, that is actually enforced for policy, right? So the concept there, I think, because people find it confusing because some quite different things are being done with policies, some of which people seem pretty convinced are useful. They may be hard to put in consensus rules. You need them for anti-spam. Maybe they're sort of hard to implement as consensus rules.
They're also a lot
useful.
more flexible, right?
But there are things,
and you can back out of them.
Yeah,
whereas like it's a lot.
Well,
harder
right. I think there are things you may actually. Right, but I think apart from that, there may be things that's actually difficult to implement with. They're easier to implement with policies than because they're sort of local context. If you want it to work globally.
I totally agree.
Right, so I'm just saying that it's not like a black and white thing, right? Because a whole array of things. But I think the concept is, if a bunch of users are doing something Bitcoin transactional, and that becomes a new network normal, then it's kind of fighting your users if you say no, we don't agree
what are
with
you
it, right?
considering network normal? Because again, if miners are mining certain things, then like that seems to be your definition of network normal.
No, that's why that's
mining...
not it. No, listen, I'm saying that if the users want to do it and are making changes to their nodes to make it so that between them, they arrange that the transactions relay through the network and they go ask the miners to accept it, or the miners are generally accepting anyway because they want to maximize fees. I think it's part of the problem. So clearly, the miners are not going to the point of disabling some of the sort of network safety policies. So there is some boundaries, but they are a bit relaxed in terms of
Yeah, but
scraping
I
together
mean,
extra transactions, right? So ultimately, it's
Adam,
down to the users.
but
But
if it
you're
is
saying the opposite,
users,
right?
it really
Yeah.
wasn't very many. It was maybe like maybe 1% of users or something like that. Like it's not representative of like the many
I
users, right?
mean, it had to
Like
be. It was representative in terms of transaction volume, though, right? There was like 10 to 50%, I think maybe in 70% of some blocks are
yeah, because
transactions that are paying
I
low
mean, because
fees,
they
right?
were otherwise empty, right? Like because the
Right.
fact that they got in is indicative of maybe the users that are using it, but it doesn't represent like majority of users or anything like that.
No, but I mean, I
Like
think my point is it's very economically rational, defensible behavior, right? So when I heard this was happening and it's reliable, I went and messaged somebody who runs a Bitcoin business, and is because of the way his wallet was working, he built up a lot of small change, which is not that economical to claim. And I said, well, now's your chance. Go mine it while the fees are still low, right? So, Bitcoin is $100,000 today. It wasn't that way 5 years ago or 10 years ago. And so I think it's rational, to say that if the blocks are not full, if the blocks were full, the fees would be over one cent anyway. So it wouldn't make any difference. But
but
if they're not
I'm
full
still not
and
getting
there
the
are people with
principle though.
transactions,
I'm still not getting the principle by which you are making these changes because the principle that I
I
outlined
mean, it's not me,
before,
but
which is that hey, if miners are mining it, then the users nodes should reflect what the miners are mining, which is the
that's not what
argument
I
that I've
said.
heard from
I
a lot.
just said it,
No, no, no.
Jimmy.
I'm
Jimmy,
not saying you're saying that. I'm saying that a lot of other
uh,
people are saying that, especially on the mailing list and so on. I've seen that
I don't think
from
so. I
I
think
mean, even you
if you
said that
read,
to me before in a private conversation that you want the pick of you for a compact block relay to work, you should have those transactions in your mempool, right? So that and that's a big priority for you. That's a big priority for a lot of core devs. I totally get that, and that's one of the principles by which you are
well, I mean,
evaluating these changes. No?
but Jimmy, look at it this way, right? So, I mean, I think one principle is if the users have a rational economic need to do it, and they're demonstrating that by banding together and getting enough peers to reliably, because of the tolerant minority factor, they can make that happen, right? And the miners are generally going to go along with things that make them money. I think you should respect the user's interest and not say, no, we don't like that, right? So who are we to
But
say?
it's not the
So that's
majority
one
of users.
factor.
It's a
And
very
the other
tiny
thing
minority, as far
is
as I
if
can
you
tell.
don't, it doesn't have to be the majority. I mean, it doesn't have to be the majority. Like Bitcoin is for the, unpopular minority, right? This is not
Well,
a
so I
majority
mean, if
rules network. It's
1%
a
of users
minority
want to
wins
do
network.
something like one set outputs, then you would let them? Like, is that the standard then?
Well, I think the effective standard is I mean, firstly, you can't really stop things because it's a peer-to-peer network, right? So there's limits to
Mm-hmm.
what you can stop. So the practical limit of what you can stop is, a sort of nudge factor and miners protecting the network, right? So there are clearly things which are quite robust, like the fee system itself, the network upgrade hooks on things which are intentionally non-standard. There are a bunch of things that are implemented that appear to be robust and like reasonably defensive in this situation, right? But the point there, I guess, is if you really wanted to override that and send some transaction to opt return to opt true, you're probably going to lose money. So it's kind of a self attack. But some of the other things are potentially like network attacks, like lightning pinning attacks. They'd override that, but the miners generally won't go along with them, right? Because they don't want to sort of degrade the network functionality and keep Bitcoin transactions working in layer two as well. So,
But
but I mean, I
I'm
think
just
you've
asking
got to bear in
whether,
mind.
like, according to your principle, which is if enough users want it, then you should have it. If you had like some number of users that are consistently getting mined one sat outputs, is that something that you would support then? Because according to that logic, if that's the principle, then that's enough. Is a bunch of these, once that output transactions start getting mined, then we should allow them so that compact block relay isn't broken. That and even if they're not using the peer-to-peer network necessarily, or just using like
I mean, I think, right.
like I'm
I mean, they
I'm
put it
just
this way,
asking the
right?
question.
Yeah, no, I mean, they put it, I mean, it's not me that's doing this. I'm just, giving my view on like what sounds logical on a kind of live question, right? And so, and it's an interesting and tricky question because there are so many different types of policies, right? But I think the limits you've got to bear in mind is, firstly, if they really want to do it, anything you do in your software won't stop them because they'll make some different software. They use Libre Relay, they use knots, they make another patch, right? Now, that's a bit of effort because a lot of people can't, necessarily don't have the skill set to do that. But if they have a serious interest, you can't really stop them. And then the other thing is, if you cause the compact blocks, if you're like, well, we don't like these transactions, they're kind of spammy, so let's filter them, which is the kind of knots argument, right? Then the risk is that, if a lot of people do that, if 99% of people do that, 95% of people do that, that the compact blocks will degrade. And then, what's going to happen in practice is the miners will, it will create orphan rates that disadvantages small miners, and the miners will work around it by using spy mining, private peering,
That kind of
fiber,
assumes a
and
continually centralized mining hegemony, right? Like, because
well,
in a sense, if you have like 50% of the mining hash power is decentralized, then that would be a very different calculation. I'm just pointing out that the scenario you're laying out assumes that the current situation of 95% of hash power being centralized being permanent.
Well, not necessarily. I mean, you could. There is another project which is called Memcool. It's using some Noster technology to relay transactions. So basically, you got to think about the transaction relaying as a sort of replaceable system. And if it doesn't satisfy the needs of users, or the miners or the users, so everything is in some kind of balance where you can discourage things to a certain level, but if you push them, lose what influence they have, right? So I think that is the sort of boundaries or contours of what you can influence. And so I think that's why the filtering discussion gets so interesting, because people want to they want to filter, and they think that if they get enough support that it might actually impact or slow down spam. Switch back from the limits of what silly things users might try to do to spam, which is kind of ultimately silly stuff, right? Like negative value in terms of blockchain resources. That if you I think everybody agrees you'd like to stop the spam, but if you filter very effectively somehow, firstly that might require reducing the decentralization of the peer-to-peer network, so it's not a flood fill or something, or it may not work, right? Or you have to get a really high threshold. But let's say somehow you get to a point where it's impacting the miner revenue, they're gonna use a different relay network. So they're gonna avoid the latency by talking to themselves, right? And of course, they still accept transactions that make it through the relay network.
I gotta change topics.
They will avoid the latency, right?
Hey guys, I gotta switch topics here.
Okay.
I think I think we're not getting anywhere on on this one. I had three more topics. I'm gonna try to combine two of them into one. Okay, so we're moving on. So Adam, so I remember like I've done presentations on it. I used to have this awesome presentation called Bitcoin's Decentral. I think it was titled Decentralization and why Bitcoin stands alone. And I would have a whole presentation about what makes Bitcoin decentralized. And unlike the proof of stake garbage, the amount of Bitcoin you have does not contribute to decentralization. It was always development, basically the coding of the protocol, how that part is decentralized, the mining, and the node operators, and how they're all kind of have a check on each other. And during that presentation, I would present, how many nodes there are in the world and what those nodes are. And I remember the last time I did this presentation, knots was like less than 1%. Knots is now at 20% and rising significantly. And this is where I'm going to combine the two questions. How is that not a concern for core? Because once Bitcoin knots captures more than 50% of all nodes, and all trends right now are indicating this is more likely to happen as more and more Bitcoin purists, Bitcoin maxis are siding with knots. How is this not a concern, considering that knots, in my opinion, is one developer? My entire argument in those presentations was the strength of Bitcoin Core and the number of their developers and how they always kind of argue with each other, but they always come to a consensus. And the advantage that Bitcoin has over everything else is they may not have the greatest developer ever, like some shitcoin projects say, and they may not have 18 billion developers like Ethereum claims they have. Bitcoin had a nice, this Dunbar number, right? Of like they have a large amount of very, very good developers. And
Yep.
they could potentially be completely ignored forever and ever and ever. And suddenly everyone is running a Bitcoin protocol controlled by one developer. How does this benefit the network? Give me some good news here, because this is how I see things going.
Yeah.
That's not good. That's not good for the protocol.
Yeah, I think it's potentially a little dangerous. So I said something which got a lot of retweets, which is, if we socially lose the ability to, evolve and upgrade the protocol, the clients, Bitcoin has got bigger problems, right? So, if things get too vitriolic, then, this could be a problem, right? Or, if too many people, so I think it's not necessarily good, because there seems to be a lot of distrust that has evolved of the developers, which I think is actually misplaced, but it seems to be there. So that in itself is a little bit of a systemic risk, I think.
I'm going to disagree a little bit, in the sense that I think this is good. You have multiple implementations. It's not just Bitcoin Core and knots, right? Although I don't think Libre Relay is going to really evolve, but that's at least another implementation. You have BTCD, you have other ones, Lib Bitcoin, and so on. Having multiple implementations means that it's not all in a particular repo. I actually think some level of ossification, especially from an economic perspective, is desirable, because you want things to stay the same for money. The reason why we don't like the dollar is because it's changing all the time in terms of supply and abilities and all this other stuff. So that's a good thing to have multiple things. Now, like there are certain risks, like if some sort of attack comes along and that takes down nodes or something like that, you want to be able to react quickly and so on. But even there, it's like, well, you have different ways of dealing with that, because you have multiple teams that are trying different things. Yes, Knots is led by Luke, but he's not the only contributor. I think Super Testnet put up a tweet. I think he has a GitHub thing of all the different contributors to Knots that did it specifically for Knots, and it's not a small list. It's not as big as Core, obviously, with like 500, 600 developers, but it's not like 2 people either. It's like 15 or something like that. So I think as the need arises, there will be more developers into other projects and so on. For a long time, Bitcoin Core has been the standard, and that's been good in most ways. But in other ways, you get a little bit of a monopoly. I I think that part breaking is not necessarily a bad thing. I think more choices for the user, more sovereignty for the user comes along with some level of decentralization there.
I'm gonna
Yeah.
give me 1 second. I'm gonna slightly push back on Jimmy here. So just like Adam back, Luke is because I mentioned it in the comments, like Adam, Luke, you guys are like in my top three, top five of the people I respect the most in the space, and this is why it's so crazy that you guys are on opposite sides of this one.
Yeah,
And
I actually don't think we're that far apart, to be honest. Like
it's
Adam and
getting.
I loved Adam's tweets back in like like May and June. He was like, "Why are you like antagonizing users?" He didn't he was arguing for 160 non-deprecation, all the stuff that I was arguing for. And yeah, it's I think more recently maybe that once it was clear that it was becoming a part of the core software that maybe we've disagreed a little more. But I think we're way more aligned than we are like apart, to be honest.
Okay, I'll that's fine. But
Mhm,
where I was going with this is, while what you say could be true, Jimmy, that there are other developers on
mhm,
Bitcoin Knots, Luke would have a disproportionate advantage of
mhm,
what the future will hold. Just like Adam would have a massive disproportionate advantage what would hold if Adam was actually coding into the Bitcoin protocol, which Adam has not done. And I think that was actually a great thing. Adam was just overseeing Blockstream and letting the developers decide what's best because I don't know, maybe Adam knew that by just having his name in the Bitcoin white paper, if he was actually, coding into the Bitcoin protocol, that would have an overwhelming say. So yes, while there would be other developers there, considering Luke's reputation and also the current, you know, the sky is falling, Bitcoin is gonna die, this fear tactic that has been coming from, Ocean's side. And I will challenge them on this when I have them on the podcast. I'm sure Mechanic is listening right now. We are going to discuss that part of it. And there are people in our live comments that are saying they are running version 30, not because they agree with core, but because they disagree with how, the sky is falling, Bitcoin's going to die narrative coming from Luke's side. And if Bitcoin Knots kind of takes over and is the dominant protocol running, with an 80-90% majority like Bitcoin Core has, that is also concerning for me. Even if I agree with the tech and knots, like just the idea of it would of course be concerning. So that's where I was kind of headed with the situation. So maybe Adam can comment.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a bit of sort of um, misunderstanding about how the Bitcoin reference client, Bitcoin Core, is working. The concept that I mean, I think people from the outside, I think you guys probably get it, but people on the outside are like, they think it's like a unified team, but it's like a dozen different not-for-profits in different parts of the world, a few companies with people like full-time or part-time volunteering, some volunteers, and then there is a release process which proposes to pull various things together out of that, make a kind of free snapshot, and then do the release process where you're doing release candidates, checking for bugs, etc., and then you move on to the next release, and they backport security stuff and things like that. So, and some of those groups are working on very different things, right? So Brink is working on security fuzzing. They've got multiple PhDs working on fuzzing to look for tests. You've got was it localhost? They're working on wallet stuff, like Miniscript, sorry, not Miniscript, Musig and taproot wallets and things like that, right? So that the Bitcoin client has support for those natively, and then that's something that other people can achieve via RPCs or pull together into libraries. So I think they're working on very different things, and they're in different places, and they're not that cohesive. They're not always agreeing on everything. So you know what a world would look like if there was Luke has continued to make contributions to it, right? He's just pulling together another release out of that same code base, and 99.99 whatever percent of knots is Bitcoin, is from the Bitcoin project, right? And the amount of horsepower they have and specialized knowledge from different people working on different things is huge, right? So I don't think you have to fight it. I think you just join the project and make another build. And to my perspective, it's probably better that you make as few changes as you need to, because the security testing is expensive and risky, right? So we've had situations where different versions of the same client are forked, like a BIP66 fork. So less changes is good. And the release candidates have bugs found in them, and there are apparently 5 like not major but kind of minor bugs in Bitcoin 30, right? And they're going to disclose them in a couple of weeks, I guess, and then they backport them to 29 and 28 for people that don't want to change something, but they want this benefit of security, right? So I think they've done that for 29. I guess 28 is coming up. And so, that is important. I think like one criticism I'd have for knots is that they haven't been very good at minimizing the change set. So apparently it's now 28,000 lines of code change, which is a lot of code. And for some of it's user interface, which is fine. Like it makes it easier to modify configuration, but a lot of it's not, because, we know and we discussed a number of things where it differs, right? So, they're blocking truck, they got the heuristic filter matching. Luke has done they still have checkpointing, which Bitcoin got away with, moved away from in 2017 with assume valid, right? So there are some philosophical differences that are long running, which are sort of maintained patch sets, and they're growing. So that is, I think, it's okay for a low percentage client, but for a high percentage client, I think the fork risk is starting to, like accidental fork risk, starting to mount up because of the amount of changes. So I think if somebody wanted to make, for example, another build that changed the limit to 160 and a few targeted things, you'd want to like minimize the code changes and try and coax, people that are specialists in that area of the code to review it, right? So that you've got minimal changes, and then there's no point Bitcoiners having Bitcoin on Bitcoin action, right? Like people are on the same mission who all hate spam, having a fist fight
Right,
over it.
but Adam, but now you're making the argument for changing less shit in the protocol, which goes back to Mr. Hodl's tweet, "Stop fucking with my money." But in the same note, one of the reasons why I literally came out of retirement to do this video is because Core is making too many changes. How do we square this circle?
Well, I think, it's instructive. I, talk with developers. I mean, not like actively involved, but I talk with developers more than the average person. I think Jimmy does as well. And once you get close to the project, you realize that there are a lot of changes that basically have to be made to keep the software working reasonably well, right? So, for example, there are things that stop being maintained. So, for example, the database that Bitcoin is using was originally by Google, and Google hasn't been maintaining it. So now Bitcoin is maintaining it. That's not a great situation, and that's a complicated, risky thing to change. But like, eventually, that probably has to be swapped out for something that's maintained. And there are lots of things like that, right? As operating systems change, as compilers change, as behaviors in the network change, as new bugs are found, you have to react, right? So I think it's pretty cautious, but there is a certain change rate you're going to have just to keep it robust. So people are looking at the result, they see the swan swimming along the lake and they say, look, 0 downtime or 99.999% downtime. But it's not because Satoshi like released a client and walked away and it's still running. It's because a bunch of people are doing a bunch of very careful and cautious changes to keep it running, right? So I fully agree with Saylor's point, however, that, it's sort of like what you're saying, right? Don't break it. And, I went to some conference with a bunch of investors and developers at the same thing, kind of invite conference. And I asked the investor guys, like, what do you want from developers? And their answer was, well, just don't break it. Like they don't want anything. They just want to break it, right? So, they didn't care about lightning or anything.
Well, this is why I say that Adam and I are in agreement. Like we don't want a lot of changes. And in fact, like
right.
This has been one of the reasons why I'm maybe less convinced than Adam that it is like a whole disparate group of people that are working on core, because they all sang from the same song sheet, except for Luke, basically, with regard to this particular change. And I was very confused because to me, as a technical person looking at this, I wasn't convinced of the 100K. I wasn't convinced of multi-op return, stuff like that. But everybody on the core side was just like, no, this is the way it has to be, including the deprecation, which they walked back on. And you look at people that are outside of the core orbit, people like Robin Linus and Lalu, and they were saying, hey, like, why are you doing this, right? Like that, and this I can go show you reference tweets and stuff. Like, why are you doing this? Like, you should not do this. And for me, that's a little bit more indicative of sort of like the groupthink that's maybe going on a little bit within core, is that, hey, let's all go along with this thing, even though, like, it's sort of setting aside almost some of the technical concerns that a lot of people outside of the core orbit are saying, and that to me is a little bit more concerning and a little bit more of an indication that there's a little more centralization going on, maybe like a little bit more groupthink. I'm not sure what happened. I don't think this was the case, for example, like say 7 years ago. But like organizations change, like the way like developers come relate to each other changes, and we've had a whole bunch of new maintainers, and we have a lot of new developers into the Bitcoin Core contributing thing. A lot of OGs
Well,
have retired and so on. So like it's
mm,
possible that like
no,
core
but
the
Jimmy,
project has
check this.
has shifted a little bit.
I don't think so because so I went through this similar process that you did, right? So what's the drama? What are the facts? Why would somebody do this? And I wasn't content to take. So I saw Parker Lewis was doing the same thing, right? It's like trying to figure it out for yourself. So I was talking to him a bit, but basically, I'm like, okay, let's hear the argument. Don't trust verify. Does that make sense to me? And the 100 kilobytes didn't make sense to me for a while. I'm like, but that's it. I mean, there was an argument, but it seemed kind of weak, basically, right? And and also why now? Like, what's the rush? And so I think the argument for why do it ahead started to make sense because they were saying, look, if you're trying to persuade the app devs to not use the fake pub keys, then it takes a while for a policy for like a default to like get adopted in the network, right? People don't upgrade very quickly, So and that you caught them early, right? They haven't mass deployed this because people like saying, "No, it's not mass deployed. Why do we care?" Well, the point is, if it got mass deployed, which is an open question, right, or some other application that runs into the same kind of proof size limit, if it does get mass deployed, it's too late. They've already implemented it. Now you've got like backwards compatibility, inertia, and that inertia is a big thing in software. So from that point of view, I thought the 160 did make sense to do now in terms of why now, right? Not urgent, but also, not let's wait until it's a problem, because once it's a problem, you lose the influence to do anything about it because they've already implemented it, right? So that made sense. And,
Right. Well, that
you
again,
know,
that
the,
can we go back to that problem already? So v30 is already out, right? So there's no putting the
right.
genie back in the bottle, right? So
Mm-hmm.
again, I'm sorry, but that why couldn't this be delayed? I mean, I'm sorry, the controversy in the Bitcoin community is great. I mean, I wish I would have done this video a month ago, but I kind of moved on and uh, like it's too late now. And if Core walks back the infinite limit down to 160K, you'd be surprised how many more people are actually going to be happy with that. I know it may seem like Core is like, walking back like Trump with every freaking sanction he tries to do on China. But at the end of the day, the stock market does go up when Trump does that. And I think it would be good for Core to admit that this was a mistake. And I'm not saying it was a mistake. This is still a debate. I'm trying to be as neutral as possible here. But the community of not the wider community, like I don't really care for the consensus opinion of the world. I care about the informed community's opinion, the ones that I feel are not brainwashed and actually did research. And I know, again, it's a murky statement on who has and who hasn't, but the general community that are aware of, how to run a node, that community is speaking for knots. And maybe it is not too late to put the genie back in a bottle, set it to 160, and then see what happens. Or why not have put in from the beginning something that, hey, let's increase this op return. Let's make it 160. Hell, let's make it, I don't know, 1,000 or something. And but it has an automatic switch to go back to 80 unless the community unless it's proven that it's not a problem. Well, why can't something like that be coded into the system? Maybe it's harder than I'm making it sound, but
Well,
could
I
there
mean,
be
I was
other
thinking,
solutions to this?
yeah, I mean, I was thinking, well, I mean, it wasn't my decision, right? I was thinking that the deprecation was a bad idea, and the deprecation didn't mean it was that the ability to edit the size was disabled. It meant that it would at some point in the future, people
Be
should expect
disabled.
it eventually get deprecated. Now, apparently things have sat in the deprecated state for years and years because inertia and somebody's using it, so they just leave it. So given that people evidently want to use it, they delete, got rid of the deprecation warning even, right? So that was a positive step. Now, I thought that 160 would have been a less controversial change. And, I think I constructed the argument, which is, even though I thought that was a socially smarter change, there is an argument. It's just not, it's not as satisfying, which is that, if it's bigger than 160 or unlimited, then what's going to happen? Well, we don't think anybody's going to use it because all the big stuff is in taproot because 4 times cheaper, right? Yeah, and so default it does nothing. So why, on the other side of the argument, why would anybody be upset about a parameter that does nothing in practice? And then the other thing is, well, what if we're wrong? What if people use 10 kilobyte images and start doing them? That's the average in taproot. Start doing 10 kilobyte images in op return, and actually that's good, or less bad, right? They have to pay more, and there's less of it. They can't clog it up as much in the blockchain because you don't get the SegWit discount, right? And then you've got the network relaying them, the miners spidering spammers and people who want to see, because there's some kind of overarching sort of philosophical learning or shift in thinking that policy should actually be closer to the consensus rules, because that is basically what people that have been looking at this for a while thought. Oh, the other thing I was want to say, Jimmy, is you were saying like a lot of new people, etc. But the blog post or description of the rationales written by Peter Wool, who's like very, very early, right? So it's not, I mean, I think Antoine championed it, but presumably multiple people working on the code and reviewing it. And so I don't think you can write it off as new people mission change, because like Peter's Peter and he's the same guy and he's very early.
I'm
right?
not saying that is the case. I'm just saying that that's a possibility given all the new
Yeah.
developers.
Well,
And
I'm just saying,
you can't just eliminate
I heard
that
that.
possibility
Yeah.
straight up.
No, I heard that, and so I was like curious, and so I had dug around a bit and realized, well, actually, no, that's like Peter gave the rationale, and he's not new, right? So that's not. I mean, it could be a risk, but it's not like a mission drift thing here. Anyway, so
Well,
to go back to the other point is, so I gave the two arguments, right? If it's not used, what's the problem? It's ineffective. It does nothing unless, and then eventually it might get used, or to our surprise, it does get used. So what? It's actually less bad, right? So from that point of view, it's kind of a bit confusing, but that does actually hold water, right? If nobody uses it, why are people who are pro filter upset about it? And if it does get used and it reduces the amount of image spam they can send per block, isn't that what we want, right? Or it makes them pay more per byte. Isn't that what we want? So why are we fighting this? Because my argument actually, because originally I was like, do 160, that's big enough. I don't see any reason. And then I heard this reason. I'm like, okay, bit confusing, but it's a reason and it's logical. But ultimately, I think the point is that there is, the sort of backdrop for it is there is a realization over time from developers that the way that people were thinking about policy versus consensus rules was a bit wrong because they'd run into multiple situations where the policy had to give way to the consensus rule due to market forces, and that will seem to be the way that things drift over time. If there's demand, if there's genuine user demand for it, and that happened to full RBF, it happened to let the one sat per VBuy. It was starting. Remember
I'm
again
not
that
convinced on that
yeah,
point though, like because
we'll talk to some developers. That's what they're saying,
no,
right?
no, but it kind of assumes the centralized mining, as we said before. That's about 90 to 95% of all hashing power in the network. In a decentralized world, I don't think those things hold. If you assume
No,
sort of
but
like a
that's
static network, that I think that logic is probably sound, but it's a dynamic network. The mining is
but
changing,
no, but I mean
and
it's
things like that.
it's just I mean I don't think it's really I think that's independent from mining being more or less centralized because it's gone through waves over the
No,
years,
no, no, no.
right?
Because policy and consensus being different is largely due to the fact that miners are centralized, and you can get them transactions that will pay bigger fees out of band. And like you can't have a 4 MB JPEG inscribed unless you're doing that directly to the miner, and those are getting mined. But if it's
Right, but I don't think
decentralized and
anybody's
it's not known that this group of 90% of hashers are in this, or the block template creators is in this place. If you didn't know that, if it was decentralized and it was on the peer-to-peer network, then they wouldn't be able to do it. So it is sort of based on the fact that it's centralized
I'm
versus
not
not.
sure. That's not how I'm thinking about it. How I'm thinking about it is kind of more like economic forces are telling us something over time, right? Which is when we start to try and impose complicated extra things that go against market forces, the things seem to tend to end up going towards what the consensus rules say.
Well,
So I think that's,
only if there's
you know,
an alternate path to get these transactions in. If it was completely decentralized, if all the miners were only on the P2P network, and it wasn't, you didn't know who was mining who, and it wasn't
yeah,
like 6 people that were making the block templates, then how would you get a non-standard transaction in other than by just mining it yourself?
through
So it would
through the
be
pitch
very, very
through the pitch.
difficult.
But Jimmy, like if you have decentralized mining, it doesn't mean you have centralized peer-to-peer networking. The tolerant minority still works, and the
Right,
miners
but I
are
mean that,
enforcing.
but
I mean, so
you
you
still can't. But how come there are so many 4 MB inscriptions when that is not standard, right? Like the only way you can get that in
because
is to mine
but
it
that's not really
yourself
what
or
we're
to
talking about, though.
use out of band.
But I think that's a slightly different category to what we're talking about. This because that isn't even like close to a policy rule, right? And it's
Mm-hmm.
extreme. It's like wasting a whole block. But I
Mm-hmm.
think what we're talking about is something like full RBF, and I was on the other side of that. I was saying, first seen safe is good, don't fight it. But my argument lost to the market, and so I think there's a lot of wisdom to say you should always carefully introspect that you are not the person that's fighting the free market. Because if you do, you're going to have an unpleasant time and you're probably eventually going to lose. So I'm looking at this picture that's, people have been wrestling with and observing for years as a kind of over time recognition and learning that actually maybe policy, you know, has limits and it will tend to converge towards consensus. So maybe we should, you know, be a bit more proactive about adapting to that because, with the full RBF, it was kind of embarrassingly late, right? If 98% of miners are already mining it, you're very behind the curve. Like the market has already long decided by the time you got there. So you're actually fighting reality and giving people the impression that they can rely on something which was completely unreliable by that stage, right?
Well, that was because you had 6 block template creators
I
that
don't think
they
I think it's
adopted before
unrelated.
everybody else. What?
I think that's a logical fallacy and that's unrelated.
No, 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 no. Because if you didn't have those 6 block template creators that included
Yeah.
those transactions, then it would have taken a lot longer, right? Like, and the network
Well,
would have been like reflecting what the blocks were being mined. It's
but
only
you don't
because you
need.
had 6 block
No, I
template
don't think so.
creators.
Because you're assuming that smaller miners are going to be dumb. Like they're just going to run the defaults and not touch it, right? But if they do a mini version of what the current miners are doing,
Well,
they would
how would the
also
small
tweak their
miners have
parameters.
heard it if they didn't hear it through the peer-to-peer network, which weren't relaying them?
It
How
relays,
would they
but we
hear?
just said that. But we just said that the tolerant minority function still works in the peer-to-peer network, even if the miners are decentralized,
If you have
right?
about 10%, and you were saying it
Right.
was
So
like
that's
like 98% before we got there.
of
So,
hash rate, right? But
mhm.
it doesn't take that much percentage of acceptance in the peer-to-peer network from power users that feel that things should go this way for some reason. I mean, to me, it seemed a bit counterintuitive because I thought, well, why not best effort enforce first seen safe? That's not very secure, but it's good enough for some use cases like a physical shop, right? So I was kind of, in hindsight, the guy arguing against market forces, but a sort of a more hyper rational behavior is that's not really enforceable. So somehow, not exactly sure why this arose, but that's the pattern, right? So anyway, you might be skeptical about it, but that is the argument in play for why
I think
people
if
are
you have a
feeling that.
decentralized network, I don't think any of your argument holds because there's no 6
Sure, it
block
does.
template creators.
It doesn't matter.
Only if you have the percolation threshold, which I don't think you had for a lot of this stuff. So like you don't have the percolation
Percolation
threshold
threshold
for 4
is
megabyte
But
inscriptions, but
percolation
they
threshold
still
is
get that.
unrelated. But percolation threshold is an observation about the peer-to-peer network is
Hmm.
unaffected by whether there are 20 miners or 200, right?
Yeah, yeah. But in the current case, what you
But
have is
let's
that you don't need a percolation threshold because you can just send it to them directly and you
but
can use
that's
peer
not you
peering and so
could,
on.
but that's you could, but that's not the situation we're talking about. I think these things were more organic than that. There are things which are, just abusive direct miner things, right? Where they got submission API and they're mining stupid stuff. But I think this full RBF was a bit more organic than that. And clearly the sub 1 sat per vbyte was more organic because you could see users saying that, oh yeah, they participate in memeing it, right? And so you get the percolation threshold from the power users and you get miners going along with it. You get more of that almost, right? When the miners are the power users. There's a guy with a garage and some, today, but he's going through a pool. So if in the future he's choosing his own block templates, that's good. But it also means he will get to set his views. And so you get more kind of view diversity in the network. And you don't need 100% of hash rate, right? Like 10, 20% of hash rate will get something done sooner or later, right? So you'll
Right.
start to
Right. So
see
if there's a
things shift.
delay, yeah. Well,
Yeah.
anyway, I think
All
Tone
right,
wants to
yeah.
move on. Yeah.
I do
So,
want to move on. I mean, we've already been streaming for almost 2.5 hours.
oh, are you serious?
Yeah.
Oh my God.
Yes, there is one more elephant in the room that we do have to address.
Mhm.
And with the elimination of op return, this now, I guess it's two parts, right? So it gives opposition to this removal, and I'm not saying this is a bad argument. I'm just saying there is an argument of now there is the potential of stuffing illicit content into the Bitcoin protocol, which could be by people that want to take Bitcoin down internally, externally. We all know how much, the government loves to play by the rules and not set anything up for their own benefit. And now there has been illicit content in the Bitcoin blockchain in the past. It's already stuck there. But this does potentially open up the Bitcoin protocol to some issues with illicit content that can't be removed. It's a concern. It's not, I don't think it's of all the concerns for the Bitcoin protocol, it'll probably crack my top 10 because this is again, not much you can do about this. And I don't think it takes Bitcoin protocol down, but it doesn't help matters that the removal of the op return limit opens it up for that. And based on this, the way this controversy goes, you know it's going to happen. So,
Yeah.
what's an argument against it, Adam? I really want to hear it.
Right. Well, I mean, I think there's a few arguments. One is there are long-established legal protections from, being held responsible for illegal stuff that ends up on your computer through no intent of yours, basically, right? There's established protections for that. So we would sooner, of
I
course, this.
I I don't think so. I'm sorry.
Yeah, there are. There
Maybe
are.
in theory there are, but shit.
Well, I
If the
mean,
if the
it would
feds
be
want to take me
preferable,
down, if the feds want to take
right?
me down, the simplest way for them to take me down is for them to put that shit on my computer.
Right. I mean, if the feds are going to in for you and they want to plant evidence, you've got other problems, mate. But but I mean, seriously, I think that of course we would all wish that that content would not get into the blockchain, right? But I think the other thing is that you've got to bear in mind some sort of internet fundamentals of physics, right? Which is basically any internet protocol, somebody could send you nasty data coded into different headers and formats, right? So people are thinking, oh yeah, well, if you sent me an email attachment and it went into my spam box and I didn't notice, and then I got in trouble, that's possible. But they could hide, like that's not really exactly how it's working in Bitcoin. In Bitcoin, it's abusing like financial transaction fees fields to like encode something that it's not designed for. And so it's more like somebody hiding some illicit content in some mail headers that you can't even see without writing special software to pull it out, right? And so I think that's the picture. Now, and it presents like a somewhat unique problem for Bitcoin because of the, full node, download everything, verify it, right? So it's hard to punch a hole in it because then you can't verify it anymore. So I think that's what people are worrying about. And then the other thing that you hear a lot about is because realistically all the images are going in taproot. So that's been 400 kilobytes for a few years. And there are images sent in other things going back decades, right? There's various crap in the blockchain in various formats going back probably 10, 15 years. And some of it's evidently already illegal from this 2018 academic report, if you Google for that one. But I think, what I saw some of the filter people arguing for, or maybe just, as a separate issue, that, oh, it's different because it's contiguous. And, I'm not sure that makes that much difference because to extract it, you actually have to run a bunch of command lines with pipes and parameters and have quite detailed knowledge about the format to even extract an image out of, the Bitcoin database. And somebody posted, example scripts of how did that, is it Wirdum code? Somebody posted it. And there's one set of script to get it out of taproot, another one to get it out of op return. It doesn't look that much difference, right? So does a court really distinguish between this so it's magically legal in one case and not in the other? That seems kind of dubious. But anyway, I think the best you could say for their argument is it sent a social message, and that's one of their arguments, right? But that's not the intent. I think probably the biggest risk is that people are making a lot of noise about it. Usually it's governments that are talking about illegal content. Think of the children. Like the UK just earlier this year was using the think of the children, the four horsemen arguments. They want to ban encryption. They keep trying every few years, and they keep getting beaten back by the civil liberties organizations and lobbyists. And they also wanted to install mandatory spyware on everybody's cell phones. So the UK seems to be not going in a good direction. But that typically works on the average person because they're like, oh, that's horrible. I will give up all my liberties immediately to solve that, right? But it's pretty unusual to see avid users of a peer-to-peer network, championing this risk of themselves because, the more you make a noise about it, the more chance there is of somebody doing it, probably. So probably the biggest risk is the people making a noise about it because evidently it's already happened, and the distinction about contiguous or not is a bit artificial. And on top of that, somebody managed to use some image format tinkering to make a contiguous image in inscriptions too, right? They just used a format that will skip over the separators. And of course, you can hide the pixels that have got the wrong color with a color palette or something like that. So if it's somehow magically a problem, if it's contiguous, it was effectively already a problem. So, and I think, the other argument is, oh, it's standard now and it wasn't in the past. But if it's a one bad image and Bitcoin has a problem, it's pretty easy to get an image there anytime since 2009, right? You could solo mine, you could rent hash rate, you could find a way to do it anonymously, right? You can pay for your hash rate with
Let
Bitcoin,
me
mine it
let me
yourself.
let me comment on a couple of things while they're still in my
Mm-hmm.
head. So, um, okay, yes, I agree that blowing this argument out of proportion is not helping matters. Those that are screaming, what's the acronym? CSAM is the
Yeah, I
official.
had to look up what that even is. Yeah,
Yeah,
didn't
CSAM,
want to know, but
official like CIA or like acronym.
yeah,
So blowing up this argument out of proportion is not helping matters. But once again,
right.
um, uh, Core and the release of v30 did not factor in that this kind of argument would be blown up out of proportion. So again, it says, why are we changing shit that isn't necessary? On the flip side of
Mm,
it, this goes back to my other argument with the spam side. Yes, we have not had to deal with this kind of illicit imaging or statements or whatever in the blockchain because space was scarce. When you eliminate the scarcity of the space of spamming the blockchain, you are potentially opening up the Bitcoin protocol to a business model where there is actual incentive of getting this shit into the Bitcoin blockchain. Where before, with limited space, you can't argue the business model aspect of it. Now, I know in this case, arguing a business model is, I'm stretching the concept a little bit,
mm,
but
yeah.
make it easier for people to do it, saying because it's already there, I'm sorry, it's hard for me to buy this argument.
Well, let's say that SegWit never existed. There's no SegWit discount. There's no taproot. There's no taproot discount. There's no inscriptions. Would anything change? They would just send a whole bunch of fake pub keys like they used to do before SegWit,
No, no,
right?
I think things would change. I mean, it would be a lot more expensive to send Bitcoin transactions. And
Not much. I
yes,
mean,
we may not be, Lightning would be a lot harder to implement. And
right.
yes, we could all be doing this show right now complaining that it's costing $20, $30 to send a Bitcoin transaction, right? So things would
Well,
absolutely change. Like the priority
both.
would be a little bit different.
Yeah, I mean, I think one way to disentangle the discount and the cost is to contemplate, to compare a bigger block or a smaller block or a bigger block, right? So if you said we got rid of the discount, but we had a 4 megabyte block or a two, like what is the average? Like 2.5 megabytes. So let's say that Bitcoin had a 2.5 megabyte block instead of SegWit, because that kind of thing was the alternative, right? Then it would be largely similar. It's just you wouldn't have the malincentive fix to encourage consolidation of change, right? And in that environment, the cost per byte would be similar, maybe a little bit more expensive, but people were already sending image spam into the blockchain long before SegWit. And the size limit, it's not even that horrendously inefficient of an encoding, right? Because the overhead is higher, but it's not that much higher. Um, and realistically, in practice, you have like op returns at 80 bytes and stuff like that. So, and like bare multisig, all this stuff can be used so you can have like a transaction with a lot of outputs and a whole row of these things, right? So the overhead is not that high when you structure it like that. So I think it's sort of, you know, looking at things with correlation rather than causation, right? To say, well, that changed, therefore that was the trigger. Like I think the trigger with the spam was the altcoin winter. The trigger here is people are upset about something because they feel that I don't know, like that didn't need to be that big. It could have been 160, or you could have left at 80. That's a reasonable argument to have. But then they search for other arguments and they throw the kitchen sink at it. And some of them are getting a bit imaginative and would apply to, a whole range of other changes. If you look at them in, if there's something else you want and you want to construct an argument, people just construct all possible arguments and see which one gets the most traction, right? So it does have the advantage for the filter people that it triggers a lot of people. That's why governments use Think of the Children when they're trying to ban encryption and install mandatory spyware, right?
Jimmy, you want to comment on this?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not really convinced of the CSAM argument either. I mean, I kind of fall into a similar camp as Adam on this, and that, it's possible to do it already. And if the government wants to screw you over or declare Bitcoin blockchain illegal, then they can do that in all sorts of other ways besides CSAM anyway. So I don't really see that, and it's not like I get that there are legal risks and things like that, and maybe potential vulnerabilities. I do question why it's being opened up like almost unnecessarily. But I mean, in a sense, I don't count this as a big risk factor, and for that reason, I don't yeah I don't think it's like really worth talking too much about because it can get in like right now you can do it contiguously on op return because it's consensus legal. So whoever wants to can kind of do what Adam said. Like even if we didn't have SegWit or Taproot or even like pay to script hash or any other software, if it were 2010, there was still a 1 MB block size limit. Somebody could still do it, right? Like, because you just need
Right.
enough hash rate, you just need the image, and you can put it into op return. It's not like it's enabled much more by this stuff. I never really did understand that part, whether it's contiguous or not contiguous, or whether it's standard or non-standard. If someone wants to do it, they just have to pay a little bit more in terms of hashing power or fees or something to get it in there. So I
Yeah.
don't I don't think it's worth worrying about because
But a
if
quick
it
quick
yeah.
question for you, Jimmy, on the follow-up. So you
Mhm.
don't feel that removing the op return limit makes it easier to get that stuff into the protocol because uh, that's the argument, right? I guess that's
Mhm.
the argument that it makes it
Yeah,
easy.
yeah.
Yes, I
I mean,
agree
it,
that it
it
should
it
be
makes it
blown out of
easier
proportion.
just by like maybe just a tiny amount, like I like the way I see it is this: if it really is like material that the government's going to prosecute for, the person that put it there is probably the most at risk, right? And the
Right.
miner that mined it probably the second most at risk. And that's been the argument for why it doesn't exist already, is that miners are too um, say, they want to stay in good graces of government, and they don't want to be accused or liable for any CSAM material in the Bitcoin blockchain. Well, then the person that's creating it is also going to have that, and that I think limits the number of people that can or could do it. And then even then they would have to like put all sorts of anonymity things for their transaction, right? It's a If you make that transaction, like there's all sorts of block analysis. They would probably have to do a bunch of coin joins or a submarine swap and a bunch of other things before they do it. I don't know. It just seems like way too much friction still that exists for that stuff to come up. It might, and I'm not entirely sure that this is the straw that breaks the camel's back, if that makes sense.
All right.
Yeah.
Thanks for, yeah, I mean, I had to just bring that topic up. All right. I think I'm ready to wrap up. I just want to close out with a few things that people, again, we do have a more beginner audience. And people think that the removal of this op return limit would actually like increase the size of the, like, I guess the blockchain, like historically. I don't think that's a
I
really
think
great
it's the
argument.
opposite, actually. Yeah, I
Um,
think it's almost the opposite because if they used it, there's no witness discount, so they can't put as much data per block, right? The 4 megs are the witness ones in a taproot. So I think, if all the images move from taproot to op return, great, we've got 4 times less image spam, right? And they're paying more for it.
yeah, that's one way. The way I was gonna try to explain it in a super basic way is that yes, what Adam just said, you won't get to use the SegWit discount. But at the same time, like right now, in a perfect world, our blocks would be full. And if Bitcoin is utilized, to its full potential, even as money, the blocks would be pretty full. And we're not, the block size limit is not being increased. It's only a matter of what is in the block and what is in the transactions. And one of the concerns on the other side of like the not side of the equation, their biggest concern is, okay, so if the blocks aren't full, let them not be full, because in the future, when it's time for the blocks to be full, because everyone is using Bitcoin as money, why should it compete with the, ordinals on steroids, with people stuffing other stuff and coming up with business models and business reasons as to why,
Yeah.
the Bitcoin blockchain is infinite free data storage, right? Which was, again, a throwback to the Bitcoin Uncensored podcast, where they constantly used to say, stop treating Bitcoin as infinite free data storage.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think everyone would like to find a solution to that, but it's pretty difficult when you've got like a by design permissionless system where as long as you are, within policy or within consensus, you can store a lot of stuff if you pay the fees. You can even do this stupid meme coin stuff, right? And there are lots of meme coin formats, right? And it was BRC and runes, but if we didn't have that, they'd be using Omni or Counterparty or RGB. And some of those things are actually even harder to filter because they're carrying the data in client-side validation, right? So I think all you see on the
But
chain is
but
less,
isn't
right?
that a good thing? Isn't that a good thing if it's
It
harder to
might
build
be.
those? Why is that a
Well,
negative?
maybe that's not a negative. I'm just saying that that is where it sort of converges because if it gets to the point where you basically can't detect it or it can't get much smaller, then what more can you do, right? Then you're on to like intent-based filtering, which is, well, I don't like why you're transacting, which is an odd thing for somebody to be arguing for in Bitcoin, I think.
Yeah,
Right.
I don't think we'll ever get there where we're figuring out how to filter things based on someone's intent. And like I
Right.
basically agree with you, Tone, that this is like you want to put as many roadblocks to spammers as possible because and every roadblock you put is a cost to them, and hopefully not to the non-spammers. You want things that sort of distinguish between the two if possible so that they stop spamming the chains. Now, that's not to say that they can't get around them, but the more roadblocks you have, the more difficult it is, the more costly it is, and that's really how we price out everything in Bitcoin is by making it more costly. Now, if we could sort of target them and like change the standardness rules to exclude certain kinds of things, then that means there's more cost, whether they have to go directly to the miner and pay like slipstream fees or, have to spin up a bunch of Libre relay nodes or like, be part of the percolation threshold of nodes that are actually relaying the stuff that they want. That's all a cost, and we want to increase the cost, even if they can minimize it or reduce it by doing certain tricks and having like smart cows or whatever. Ultimately, we want to put more cost on spam, and I think that's a good thing. And I want Bitcoin to be financial, and like I want it to be mostly used for what we're doing. There's a particular person, a certain. In fact, I want all of it to be what we're using it for, which is good money, and that's what we're all trying to argue for. Unfortunately, there's a bunch of things that are happening on the network, which are preventing that, and we have sort of like different visions on how to get to that point, and that's what we're ultimately arguing about with this controversy.
And real quick to that, Adam, and it goes back to again something you said. I don't remember if it was you and I over dinner or you and I on one of these podcasts, where back in the SegWit debate, in order to get like one of the main reasons to get SegWit in was to fix transaction malleability, which, and by fixing that, you are making it so much easier to build a Lightning network. And that was one of the statements that you were saying, and a lot of people were saying. And I remember very clearly, because I guess my memory is still a little too good. I'm not getting that old. And you said, well, if SegWit doesn't get in, we can still do Lightning. It would be an elegant solution. It would be just a lot more complicated. And that's why the whole Lightning development like slowed, like got grinded to a halt for like a year waiting for SegWit. Now that we're 8 years since that time, maybe not 8, but close to 8 years since that time, maybe Lightning being a not so elegant solution and a more complicated solution was the better way to go, because Lightning is worth the effort of a complicated solution where a lot of these spam protocols on top of Bitcoin would not have been worth the difficulty of a non-elegant Lightning solution. So maybe difficulty is not a bad thing on top of Bitcoin.
Well, I mean, they're like, I think you could argue that both ways, because Lightning is already proving quite complicated to make secure at the limit. Like, there are multiple things that have arisen that people have had to fix. This recent version 3 thing in, I guess, version 29 and 30, it's taken years to, adapt to all the things that came up. So if we'd started without the advantage of SegWit, presumably that would all have been worse. And I think the discount was actually separate. You could have had SegWit without the discount, right? So the discount was argued for in terms of trying to fix a malincentive to never consolidate change, because it was cheaper to split a new coin, which, I think it was actually not quite enough. So, maybe if we get cross-input signature aggregation, it will finally make that, profitable to consolidate change rather than split new coins and create a bit more incentive. But yeah, I mean, I think that. So what was the topic that Jimmy was summarizing? This was more about the spam trend. Yeah, I mean, actually, I think we were talking about the meme coins, right, and where that trends. So I think that, it's probably somewhere where they can converge, where they become hard to, make more efficient. So if people are at least doing something efficient, that's less annoying. Of course, they're doing silly, scammy things, but, that ultimately some of these protocols are like color coins, so they're kind of hard to stop, right? And I mean, RGB and taproot assets are basically Lightning-enabled color coins, so they probably have a similar effect ultimately, and they don't have much on-chain footprint. But yeah, I mean, I think it would be nice if there was a way to make them more expensive. I think there's often a problem that you get side effects which could, in some cases, be worse for the regular user. Because, I mean, to give just one example, with Bitcoin as a serious project, oh, we lost Tone temporarily.
Yeah, he's coming back.
Yeah. I mean, Bitcoin's a serious project, so...
My connection dropped off and the stream almost ended. So I think that's a cue for us to wrap it up so we can have a proper closing.
Yeah. So let's go quick. So yeah, I mean, I think that ultimately you've got some kind of trade-off where if you push things too far beyond a bounds, it starts to create more problems than it fixes, right? So, and I think the other thing is, for the intuition with spam is as old as the internet. So we're probably not going to be able to eradicate it. Best we can do is sort of try to beat it into shape so it's efficient, and, get more genuine users on there so it gets prices them out, because at least image spam is inherently more expensive. Bitcoin transactions are quite small. Image spam is bigger. So that's my last 2 cents.
All right, Jimmy, final words, and then I'll close us out. And then we're gonna go through, who we pissed off. I gotta apologize. Like Luke Dash Jr. is like blowing up my phone. He's
I
upset
guess
that
they're all watching the stream, huh? All right. Yeah.
he's upset that I said that Knots is Luke, and I gotta fix that one so he can come on maybe even tomorrow. And Jimmy, stick around for 2 minutes. I want to talk scheduling because I do want to have Luke Dash on and Mechanic and maybe a few more people, and I want to see when you're available. I would love to do this tomorrow with Luke at the same time.
All right. Well, we'll talk about that after. But
Yeah.
I think my position is I think similar to what I said earlier, which is that you have two different visions of how to reduce spam. I think one way is to put like a garbage can. Here's op return. Go use this for putting all of the spam in, and since we can prune it, especially for the UTXO set, that's the way to do it. The problem there, I think, is that not everyone's going to use the garbage can. There are people like Mike in Space who will be making stamps protocol, which embeds stuff in a way that is maximally painful to Bitcoiners, because honestly, a lot of these spammers hate Bitcoin, right? They want to promote other stuff, and they're only doing this to grief us, and that's part of the value that they find. The other way, I think, which is I think what a lot of other people are saying is, hey, let's make it as unwelcoming to them as possible, and let's not invite them to go use this garbage can or whatever, but just harass them out of Bitcoin. Now that's like, to some degree, I think it'll work. To another degree, maybe it makes them more antagonized and wanting to spam it even more. I don't know, but I think those are the main two approaches. Hopefully, I'm presenting them reasonably accurately. But I'm not saying that this one way is the way to go, or that the entire Bitcoin network should go in one way. I understand that there are differing opinions and so on. My personal belief is that rejecting and making it more difficult for spammers is the way to go, just because that's, in my experience, how you get people that want to harass you off your back is to fight back. And I'd rather not negotiate with terrorists, but to like just punch them back. So something like that. So that's my personal belief, but I understand people feel differently, and there's significant discord over this over the past 6 months or so, and we'll be talking more about it probably for even longer. We didn't even touch on like who's actually like running what. I was looking at like the latest stats on core v30 adoption, at least listening nodes according to the Collect Meridian dashboard. It's something like 448 or 490 nodes that are running core v30, which is about 2.5%, which is well below the percolation threshold. And Knots, which was released around the same time, I think it's like a fork of 29 or something like that. It's something like it's a little bit more than that, 530 or something like that. So that tells me kind of roughly where the community is at, and maybe that's something that we can discuss on the next one.
Yeah, I mean, I think another point which is worth reinforcing, because people are, seeing drama and probably not fully understanding, is this a problem for them, is that ultimately, different groups of users can run different policies and be happy, right? I can run my policy, Jimmy can run his policy. We coexist in the network. We both hate spam. We both love Bitcoin. We don't have to agree about policy level things. Of course, everybody has to agree about consensus level things, but that's a very different thing, right? So it's worth keeping in mind, and that's probably going to be the way it goes, right? But people are going to make different policy decisions, and then it sounds like there might be some work needed in the network to make the compact blocks a little more resilient to that reality, because there's more different configurations now, and that presumably is going to continue. So I think there was some concepts like
All right,
weak
who's
blocks
frozen? Me or
and
them?
you yeah, there are concepts like weak blocks and template, like gossiping templates, which can help kind of consolidate and provide hints of what's likely to be in the next block. So I think that can sort of make the network a bit more robust to a larger difference in mempools, basically. So maybe some work will get done on that as well. So if there's a demand from people to run different policies, I think ultimately the network can be, I think it's quite resilient, but it can be made sort of to function performantly with, working with that larger difference in mempools. Still with us, Tone?
I think he's gone, and probably our live
Maybe we should wrap it
streaming
then.
is probably done. I'm actually I have to stay on so he can schedule something with me. But
All right.
yeah. I think
All right.
we're done. Maybe we're still live. I don't know. I guess we can pull up the YouTube and find out. Give me a second. Where is the YouTube?
Well, I have it, but
Oh, it's in the thing that we retweeted.
yeah, no,
Let
it's
me
still
go
working.
to
It's
the.
still working. I just want
Okay.
to turn the audio off. So okay, we can wrap it up on Tone's behalf, I guess, because he's obviously having network problems there.
Yeah, well,
All right.
it was good chatting with you. Looking forward to seeing you in Lugano. And I think Tone will have something to say to finish it.
Oh,
We're
he's
still
back.
live, I think. Yeah.
All right. So
Are we still live on the same
it looks
stream?
like it.
Yeah.
It looks like it. Yeah. Do you want to wrap it up, Tone?
Yeah, I probably should wrap it up. Yeah, Adam, hope you're not upset. I hope you don't feel like you were like kind of railroaded by us, but I did not have a plan going into this. Like I said, I've completely stayed away from this topic, and I was just coming up with my questions as the show was moving on. So we may have you come back. I don't know how many parts we're gonna do, but it sounds like there is a few more people that Jimmy and I will, do this to. And look, we're gonna ask tough questions to the other side also. If the other side
Yeah.
rage quit in the middle of our questions, I mean that's not gonna look good
Well,
either. So
right. I'm always happy to entertain all questions. That's how Bitcoin works, right? Or any scientific process, in fact, right? You have an opinion or a view or an argument. The way you test your argument is you engage in robust debate about it and test it, right? And my views on it evolved in the last few weeks as I try to catch up and like reproduce the argument. So it's all good from that point of view. I think you need to get some kind of technical core proponent on with Luke uh, to kind of bounce, to ask tough questions, let's say.
well, we'll do one just from Luke's side first,
Mm-hmm.
and then we'll see where it goes from there. Let's see how that goes. Hopefully, Jimmy Song and myself will get to challenge Luke on some of the stuff, even though there may not be a core technical person to immediately counter the technical side that Luke would say. But again, his if he comes on, hopefully he's not too pissed at me. And Luke, we would love to get you for the next show. And maybe, on our last part, maybe we will, be able to get Luke and someone tech, tech, technical from the other side on the same show. So we'll see where it goes. I'll chat with Jimmy off air, and we'll do we'll do a series on this just so people have a real understanding and make their own decision as to what implementation they should run. And not be scared that some kind of a Bitcoin catastrophe is coming, like a hard fork. So
Yeah,
we'll
right.
do a little bit of a series.
Sounds good, Tone.
Yeah.
All right. All right. Thanks, Adam. Thanks for joining. Shoot me any links you want me to put in the video description. I'll add, I mean, everyone knows you. Anyone watching this knows where you guys are on Twitter and stuff and your channels, but we'll add them in
Yeah.
anyway and go from there.
All right. Thanks. Bye, everyone.
All right. Thanks, Adam. All right. Thanks, guys.
Thanks.
Thanks for watching. And everyone's asking about the price of Bitcoin. I know it crashed to below 108. Great job, guys. I think we did that. And but I'll do a price show tomorrow morning for sure. And I'll keep an eye on my Twitter for when this next show is going to happen. Bye, guys.